Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Echoes in the windows. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The divorce had left behind a silence that clung to the furniture like dust. My house on Maple Crescent, once a two-person operation, was now a cavernous single-player campaign. I was Alex, 33, a freelance graphic designer who spent most of his waking hours staring at a screen, manipulating pixels into corporate logos and sterile web banners. The screen was my portal to a world of deadlines and invoices, a clean, logical space that was the antithesis of the emotional shrapnel littering my life. The house was in a quiet suburb of Toronto, the kind of place where the loudest sound was usually the Saturday morning symphony of lawnmowers. It was October, and a belligerent cold snap had descended, plastering the neighborhood in a premature frost. I'd lived here for 6 years, long enough to learn the rhythms of the street, the precise time Mr. Henderson across the way retrieved his newspaper, the route Mrs. Pavlovich next door walked her wheezing bulldog, the way the setting sun ignited the windows of the houses opposite mine into fiery orange rectangles. It was that last detail, that simple, reliable phenomenon, that changed first. It started on a Tuesday. I was taking a break, nursing a mug of tea and staring out my home office window. The sun was low, but the houses across the street weren't on fire. Their windows weren't reflecting the brilliant hues of the sunset. Instead, they held a flat, dead light. It wasn't a reflection of the overcast sky, it was something else, something self-contained. It was the dim, gray flicker of an old television set, tuned to a dead channel. A constant, restless snow of light, contained within the glass. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Stress. Lack of sleep. The divorce was a meat grinder for the nerves. Sarah, my ex-wife, had told me I noticed things too much, that I'd fixate on a loose thread until it became a rope to hang myself with. She was probably right. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a peculiar atmospheric effect. But the next evening, it was the same. And the evening after. A row of houses, all reflecting the same static ghost. Then came the second oddity. Despite the temperature hovering just above freezing, my neighbors started keeping their windows open. Not just cracked for air, but wide open. I saw Mr. Henderson, a man who wore a toque indoors if it dipped below 20 degrees Celsius, standing in his living room, perfectly still, his silhouette framed by the open window. He wasn't looking out. He seemed to be looking at the glass itself, mesmerized by that phantom flicker only I seemed to see. He stood like that for nearly an hour, motionless as a garden gnome. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some new kind of energy-efficient glass, some smart home technology that had a weird default setting. Maybe it was a neighborhood trend I wasn't cool enough to be in on, like a silent, passive-aggressive protest against the hydro rates. A week into the phenomenon, the Pavloviches joined in. Their big bay window, usually sealed tight against the elements to protect their collection of porcelain dolls, was now wide open to the biting wind. And there they were, both Mr. and Mrs. Pavlovich, standing side by side, their gazes fixed on the pane. They didn't speak or move. They just watched. The silence of my own house was no longer a sad, empty thing. It was becoming a charged, watchful silence. I felt like the only person left in the audience after the play had ended, while the rest of the patrons had decided to stay and stare at the blank curtain. My anxiety, a familiar companion, began to sharpen its teeth. I called Sarah. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Quick, weird question. Have you noticed anything strange with windows lately?" Her sigh was immediate, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. "Alex. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. It's just, the light. It looks weird. Across the street. And people are leaving their windows open. In this cold." "Okay," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of cautious patience one uses with a child or a madman. Maybe they like the fresh air. Maybe there's a new type of window film. Did you finish the banner ads for that dental clinic? Yeah, I sent them over. But Sarah, they're just standing there. 4 hours. People are weird, Alex. You're cooped up in that house. You need to get out more. Go for a walk. Go to a bar. Please don't start spiraling. Spiraling. The word hung in the air after she hung up. Was I? The divorce had untethered me. Maybe my brain was just desperately trying to find a pattern in the chaos, latching onto the mundane and twisting it into the monstrous. That night, I decided to collect data. If I was going crazy, I wanted proof. If I wasn't, I wanted proof of that, too. I dug out my DSLR camera, the one I used for professional texture and product photography, and fitted it with a telephoto lens. My hands trembled slightly as I propped the camera on the windowsill, the cold from the glass seeping into my elbows. Through the lens, the scene was the same. The Henderson house, the Pavlovich house, 3 others down the crescent. All with open windows. All with inhabitants standing like statues before them. The light in their windows remained a flat, flickering gray, refusing to resolve into anything definite. I focused on Mr. Henderson's window, adjusted the exposure, and pressed the shutter. The click echoed in my silent office. I took a dozen more photos, documenting each house, each silent vigil. I uploaded the images to my computer, my heart thudding with a strange mix of dread and vindication. On the surface, the photos were unremarkable. Grainy, low-light images of suburban houses. The strange light in the windows just looked like a weird reflection, easily dismissed. Disappointment soured in my stomach. Sarah was right. I was building a cathedral of paranoia out of nothing. Instinct, honed by years of digital manipulation, took over. I opened one of the photos of Henderson's window in my editing software. On a whim, I started playing with the levels, cranking the contrast up to an absurd degree, pushing the shadows down into pure black and blowing out the highlights. It was a technique I used to find imperfections in product shots. And there it was. My breath hitched. In the chaotic digital noise of the gray flicker, a shape emerged. It was faint, like a watermark on cheap paper, but it was unmistakably there. A silhouette. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bent at angles that felt profoundly wrong. Its head was a small, neat oval atop a long, swan-like neck. It wasn't standing in the room with him. It seemed to be superimposed on the glass itself, an image being displayed. An echo. I quickly applied the same extreme contrast adjustments to the other photos. Every single one had them. Each window displayed a faint silhouette, and none of them were human. One was squat and broad, with far too many arms. Another was a chaotic tangle of sharp, geometric lines, like a broken schematic. They were all different, all alien. And Mr. Henderson, the Pavloviches, my other neighbors, they weren't just staring at a blank flicker. They were watching something I couldn't see. They were tuned into a broadcast, and the faint figures in my photographs were the hosts. The quiet contagion had a face. And it was staring right back. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The discovery of the silhouettes didn't bring relief, it brought a cold, suffocating terror that was far worse than the creeping unease that had preceded it. Sanity, it turns out, is a numbers game. When you're the only one seeing the monster, you're the one who gets locked away. I spent the next 2 days in a state of hypervigilant paralysis, oscillating between frantically checking the windows across the street and staring at the horrifying images on my monitor. The watchers were consistent. Their vigils began around dusk and lasted well past midnight. They were economical with their movements. A slow turn of the head, a slight shift in posture, but otherwise, they were statues. The open windows, I realized, weren't for fresh air. An open window has no reflection. It offers a clear, uninterrupted view of the glass itself, of the screen. My isolation deepened until it felt like a physical pressure in my chest. The world outside my front door was no longer familiar. The mundane rituals of suburbia now seemed like a fragile performance, a play being staged for an audience of one, me. The mailman whistling his tune, the joggers puffing past in their fluorescent gear, the teenagers laughing at the corner bus stop, were they all in on it? Or were they just the unwitting backdrop to a silent, creeping invasion of consciousness? I had to try again. I couldn't live inside this secret terror alone. This time, I wouldn't call. I needed to see a face. I chose Mrs. Gable, 2 doors down. She was a sweet, elderly widow whose primary companion was a fat, marmalade-colored cat named Patches. Our interactions had always been pleasant, limited to hellos over the fence and the occasional retrieval of her escaped pet. She was the epitome of normalcy. I found her weeding her frostbitten petunias, her movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Gable," I started, my voice sounding strained. "Hi, it's Alex." She looked up, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Alex, dear. How are you holding up?" She meant the divorce. The whole street knew. "I'm okay. Listen, this is going to sound very strange, but I have to ask. Have you noticed the windows?" Her smile didn't falter. "The windows? What about them, dear? Across the street. The Hendersons, the Pavloviches. They're open all the time. And the people inside, they just stand there." I left out the part about the light and the silhouettes. "Baby steps." She patted the soil around a dead flower. "Oh, that. Robert Henderson told me it's for a new kind of air quality study. Something to do with the city. They have sensors that need ambient air. Very technical." She said it with such bland, simple confidence that for a moment, I almost believed her. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed explanation. A study? In this cold? And it makes them stand motionless for hours? Her smile tightened, just a fraction. A flicker of something cool passed through her eyes. "Well, I'm sure they have their reasons. People are entitled to their privacy, aren't they? It's not our place to stare into their homes." The gentle admonishment was a steel door slamming in my face. The conversation was over. I retreated to my house, the walls feeling closer than ever. Her explanation was a lie. It had to be. It was too neat, too dismissive of the sheer strangeness of the act. Was she one of them? Or was she just repeating a pre-packaged story designed to placate the curious? That night, I saw a new light turn on. In Mrs. Gable's living room window. And soon after, her small, stooped silhouette appeared, framed by the newly opened sash. My blood ran cold. It was spreading. My work, my one bastion of logic, began to suffer. I missed a deadline. I sent a client the wrong file format. The clean, ordered world of pixels was being invaded by the messy, terrifying reality outside my window. I began keeping a journal, a digital file buried deep in a password-protected folder. I logged the times, the houses, the duration of the vigils. I created a separate file for the enhanced photographs, labeling each silhouette, the stickman, the spider, the shard. It felt like a pathetic attempt to impose order on the incomprehensible. Desperate for connection, I turned to the internet, the great repository of human obsession and paranoia. I avoided mainstream sites, knowing I'd be dismissed as a crank. Instead, I waded into the murky depths of fringe forums and obscure blogs. I searched for keywords: window flicker, strange reflections, compulsive staring, sensory anomalies. Most of it was useless noise: ghost stories, alien abduction tales, conspiracy theories about 5G towers. But after days of searching, I found it. A single post on a long-dormant forum dedicated to liminal phenomena. The post was from 3 years ago, by a user named Cassandra_79. Subject, echoes in the glass. Has anyone else seen them? Not ghosts. Not reflections. It starts with the light, like TV static on glass. Then you start to feel it. The compulsion to watch. To stand. To open the window so nothing gets in the way. It's not in the house. It's in the glass itself. They are echoes from somewhere else. They show you things. You just have to be willing to look. Don't try to take pictures. It makes them notice you. The final sentence sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. It makes them notice you. I had a folder with nearly 100 high-resolution photographs. My secondary mystery, the small, mundane subplot to my personal horror story, began the next day. Mrs. Gable's cat, Patches, went missing. For 2 days, she was frantic, a caricature of a distressed pet owner. She put up flyers with Patches' dopey, orange face on them. She knocked on my door, her eyes red from crying, asking if I'd seen him. I felt a pang of genuine sympathy. It was a real, understandable tragedy in a world that had stopped making sense. I helped her search, calling his name in the twilight, the sound swallowed by the profound silence of the watching houses. On the 3rd day of the search, I saw her. She was back at her post, standing before her open window, bathed in the dead, flickering light. She was as still and placid as Mr. Henderson. The panic, the grief over her lost cat, it was gone, wiped clean. Later that evening, driven by a terrible premonition, I walked down the street, my own breath pluming in the cold. I kept my eyes low, avoiding the luminous windows. On the edge of Mrs. Gable's lawn, right beneath the sill of her open living room window, lay a small, red collar with a silver bell attached. It was Patch's collar. It was placed neatly, deliberately, like a small, sad offering. An offering to the glass. Or to what lay behind it. The contagion didn't just make you watch. It erased the things that made you human, your worries, your attachments, your love for a fat, orange cat. It hollowed you out and turned you into a placid receiver for a silent, alien broadcast. And I had a collection of high-definition photographs that proved I was listening in. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. It makes them notice you. Cassandra_79's warning became a mantra of terror. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the siding, was a sign that I had been marked. I stopped taking photographs. I began to feel a palpable sense of being observed, not just by the watchers across the street, but by the phenomenon itself. The static in their windows felt directed now, a humming, invisible pressure against my own home. My research became my obsession. I abandoned my design work entirely, letting emails from angry clients pile up unanswered. The forum post from Cassandra_79 was a dead end, she hadn't posted in years. But her words, echoes in the glass, gave me a new vocabulary. I plunged back into the digital abyss, searching for academic papers on perceptual disorders, declassified documents on psychotronic weapons, and esoteric texts on scrying and dimensional theory. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unlikely source, a digitized, out-of-print book from the 1970s by a disgraced astrophysicist named Dr. Eris Thorne. The book, The Silicate Veil, posited a wild theory. Thorne argued that certain types of glass, under specific, unknown environmental pressures, geological, atmospheric, or perhaps something else entirely, could act as weak transactional mediums. Not portals, but something more subtle. He claimed they could become entangled with distant realities, developing a perceptual resonance. He wrote of echoes of consciousness, imprinting themselves onto the silicate structure, broadcasts from realities with different physical laws and, presumably, different inhabitants. Thorne was ridiculed, his career ruined. But his descriptions matched what I was seeing with terrifying precision. He wrote of a low-energy visual static, a compulsive fascination in subjects, and, most chillingly, gradual overriding of the host consciousness by the resonant echo. The watchers weren't being controlled. They were being replaced, their personalities eroded and overwritten by the signal they were absorbing through the glass. They were becoming human antennae for a broadcast from nowhere. This new, terrifying hypothesis gave me a sliver of agency. If it was a resonance, a frequency, perhaps it could be blocked. My house became a fortress of paranoia. I covered my windows with thick blackout curtains, and then, not satisfied, I nailed blankets over the curtains, plunging my home into a perpetual, dusty twilight. I felt a small measure of relief, a sense that I had at least hung up the phone on the creeping whisper. But the world outside my bunker was changing. The phenomenon was escalating. The watchers were no longer just static observers. They had begun to move in eerie, subtle synchronicity. One evening, unable to resist, I peeked through a tiny gap in my blanketed window. Across the street, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Pavlovich, and Mrs. Gable all tilted their heads to the left at the exact same moment, a slow, graceful, and utterly inhuman gesture. It was like watching a flock of birds, or a school of fish, directed by a single, invisible will. They were becoming a collective. The threat, as Cassandra_79 had warned, was turning towards me. One night, a package arrived on my doorstep. A plain brown box with no return address. My heart hammered against my ribs as I brought it inside. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside, nestled in foam, was a single, flawless pane of glass, about a foot square. There was a note with it, printed in a simple, sans serif font. "We noticed you're having trouble seeing. We thought this might help. Join the conversation." I nearly screamed. I dropped the pane, but it didn't shatter on the hardwood floor, it landed with a soft, dull thud, as if it were made of rubber. I kicked it away from me, scrambling backwards until my back hit the wall. They knew I was here. They knew I was hiding. And they were inviting me to join. This wasn't a virus of the body. It was an invitation to surrender the mind. My desperate search for an ally felt more urgent than ever. I decided to try and find Cassandra_79 herself. Her username was unique. I ran it through every social media platform, every online directory I could think of. I found a match on an old, forgotten photo-sharing site. A profile for a woman in her late 40s from Barrie, an hour north of Toronto. Her name was Cassandra Nowak. The profile was mostly pictures of her garden and her cat. The last photo was uploaded 3 years ago, around the time of her final forum post. It was a picture of a new window she'd had installed in her living room. Driven by a madness I no longer bothered to question, I got in my car and drove. The hope that I might find the one person who understood, who had fought this and survived, was a powerful narcotic. I found her house in a quiet subdivision almost identical to my own. As I pulled up, a wave of nausea washed over me. The living room window was wide open, a gaping black square in the fading light. And framed within it was the silhouette of a woman, standing perfectly still. I sat in my car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. My potential ally, the one who had warned me, had become a watcher herself. Perhaps she had never escaped. Perhaps her post wasn't a warning, but a final, fading echo of the person she used to be before she succumbed. The hope that had propelled me on the journey curdled into despair. There was no one else. There was no cavalry coming. I was alone. As I started the car to leave, a movement caught my eye. The figure in the window, Cassandra, turned her head. She wasn't looking at the glass. She was looking directly at my car. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. And then, from the house next to hers, and the one next to that, other figures at other open windows turned. One by one, a chain reaction of watchers, all turning their placid, smiling faces towards me. They knew I was here. And they were welcoming me home. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation, Revelation, and Aftermath. The drive back to Toronto was a blur of streetlights and rising panic. The synchronized turn. Cassandra's knowing smile, it shattered my last defense. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was a character in their silent play, the one who refused to learn his lines. The pane of glass they'd sent me sat on my passenger seat, a dark mirror reflecting nothing. It felt heavy, imbued with a terrible purpose. Back in my blacked-out house, the silence was no longer a comfort. It was the held breath before a scream. I couldn't live like this, buried alive in my own home, waiting for them to break down the door or simply mail me another, bigger piece of glass. The not knowing was a worse torture than any truth they could reveal. Sarah's voice echoed in my head, "You fixate on a loose thread." Maybe she was right. I had to pull it. I had to see what unraveled. My confrontation wouldn't be with a person. It would be with the source. The original point of infection. Mr. Henderson's window. It was almost 3 a.m. The street was dead, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. I left my house, the cold air a shock to my system. I didn't take my camera. I didn't take a weapon. I just took myself. I walked across the asphalt, each step an eternity. The Henderson house was dark, save for the living room. The window was open, a maw in the face of the house. And he was there, a sentinel at his post. As I approached his lawn, he didn't move. He didn't react. His focus was absolute. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I stepped onto his perfectly manicured grass, my feet sinking into the cold, damp turf. I walked right up to the window, so close I could feel the frigid air pouring out from the room. I stood beside him, a trespasser at a sacred ritual. He still didn't look at me. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, fixed on the pane of glass just inches from his face. I followed his gaze. I leaned in, my breath misting, and I looked. I forced myself to see past the reflection of my own terrified face. I looked into the static, the dead channel flicker. For a moment, there was nothing. Just gray, swirling noise. I thought, this is it, this is madness, there's nothing here. Then, the static resolved. It wasn't like watching a screen. It was like falling through it. My senses warped. The sound of my own blood in my ears became a roar, then faded into a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my bones. The smell of the cold night air was replaced by the scent of ozone and something ancient, like dust from a tomb sealed for millennia. And I saw what they were watching. It wasn't a single image. It was a glimpse, a shattered keyhole view into another place. A city, perhaps, but not one of steel and concrete. It was a city built of pure information, of crystalline structures that pulsed with a cold, internal light. The sky was a tapestry of shifting geometric patterns, and the ground was a sea of whispering code. The silhouettes from my photographs were there. They weren't echoes. They were the inhabitants. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace through their impossible architecture. They weren't looking back at us. They were simply living. They were going about their existence, and the light of their world was, through some cosmic accident of physics and silicate, bleeding through into ours. The horror of it was not in their malevolence, but in their utter, soul-crushing indifference. We were not being invaded. We were not being communicated with. We were plankton, absorbing the faint radiation of a distant, unknowable sun. The watchers across my street hadn't been chosen. They were simply the unlucky ones who had the right kind of glass and the right kind of mind to pick up the signal. Their consciousness was being slowly, passively eroded and overwritten by this glimpse into a reality so complex and alien it was like a poison to the human mind. They were becoming living reflections of a world that didn't even know they existed. I saw the stickman tending to a garden of singing crystals. I saw the shard phase through a solid wall of light. I saw it all for a fraction of a second that felt like 1,000 years. I ripped my gaze away, stumbling backward, falling onto the wet grass. The world snapped back into focus with a nauseating lurch. The hum in my bones faded, but a sliver of it remained, a faint tinnitus in the core of my being. Mr. Henderson hadn't moved. I had just peered into the heart of his God, and he hadn't even blinked. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran back to my dark, safe house, locked the door, and collapsed, shaking. I knew the truth now. There was no fighting this. How do you fight a sunrise? How do you wage war on a radio wave? You can't. You can only change the channel, or smash the radio. The next day, I packed a single bag. I left everything else behind, the house, the furniture still holding the ghost of my marriage, the high-end computer full of horrifying photographs. I smashed the pane of glass they'd sent me with a hammer. It shattered with a sickening, musical chime that echoed for far too long. I live in a basement apartment in the west end of the city now. There are no windows. Not a single one. The walls are concrete, and the only light is the warm, yellow glow of incandescent bulbs. I've abandoned graphic design. I work a cash job stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store, a noisy, chaotic, fluorescent-lit place that is beautifully, blessedly free of clear panes of glass. I wear headphones constantly, listening to loud music, anything to drown out the silence. I have not been cured. I have been amputated. I can't look at a smartphone screen for too long. Reflective surfaces, a puddle on the street, a polished countertop, someone's sunglasses, make my stomach clench. The contagion is still out there, a quiet, patient broadcast, waiting for the right receiver. Most nights, I am fine. But sometimes, when the world is quiet and I am tired, if I close my eyes too hard, I can still see it. Behind my own eyelids, a faint, swirling flicker. The ghost of a forgotten broadcast, waiting for me to tune in. The echo in the glass is now an echo in my skull. I haven't escaped. I've just learned how to live in a smaller prison. The quiet contagion, the forgotten word. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The fog in Port Blossom, Oregon, is not a weather event, it's a permanent resident. It rolls in from the Pacific each evening and often doesn't burn off until noon the next day, softening the edges of the world, muffling sound, and smelling of salt and damp pine. I've lived here for 15 years, taught history at Port Blossom High for 12 of them. At 42, my life is a series of well-worn paths, the 10-minute drive to school, the lectures I can recite from muscle memory, the solitary evenings with a microwave dinner and the ghost of my wife, Sarah. The fog, like my grief, is a constant companion. It started on a Tuesday. A particularly dense, dripping Tuesday. I was in my third period U.S. history class, trying to coax 16-year-olds into caring about the Cold War. My lesson plan centered on the Kennedy assassination, a cornerstone of modern American consciousness. The event, I said, pacing before the whiteboard, is a flashbulb moment for an entire generation. Ask anyone over a certain age, and they can tell you exactly where they were, what they were doing. It's a powerful collective memory. I paused for effect, scanning their faces. Blankness. Not the usual teenage boredom, but a deeper, more placid incomprehension. Kevin, I said, pointing to a lanky kid in the back row who usually had a smart remark ready. Let's talk about that. The power of a shared memory. Why is that important for a nation's identity? Kevin blinked slowly, his brow furrowed. A shared, what, Mr. Hatcher? Memory, I repeated. The act of remembering. He exchanged a look with the girl beside him, a flicker of mutual confusion. I don't. I don't think I know that word. A nervous titter went through the class. I felt a flash of irritation. Was this some new slang, some coordinated prank to get under my skin? All right, very funny, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. I turned to the whiteboard and picked up a dry erase marker. Let's break it down. I wrote the word in big, block letters, memory. The moment the last letter was complete, a wave of nausea washed over me. The word looked wrong. Utterly alien. The two M's seemed aggressive, the O a gaping void, the R a jagged spike. It felt like a string of arbitrary symbols, a typographical error in the language of reality. I stared at it, my heart beginning a low, anxious thrum against my ribs. I could feel the meaning of the word in my head, the concept it represented, but the visual signifier on the board was a foreign intruder. I shook my head, clearing it. Stress. I hadn't been sleeping well. My annual review with Principal Davies was next week. It was just stress. It's the faculty of the mind by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved, I said, forcing the definition out. The words felt like stones in my mouth. A girl in the front row, Ashley, a bright student, raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Hatcher, are you feeling okay? You look pale. The concern in her voice was genuine, but it was layered with the same bewilderment I'd seen in Kevin. They weren't mocking me. They genuinely didn't understand. The bell shrieked, saving me. The students filed out, whispering amongst themselves, casting worried glances back at me and the strange, ugly word on the whiteboard. I erased it with frantic energy, the squeak of the eraser on the board grating on my nerves. The unease followed me into the staff lounge. Lena Petrova, the English teacher, was pouring herself a cup of tar-black coffee. I had a quiet, hopeless crush on Lena. She was sharp and funny, with eyes that always seemed to be laughing at a private joke. Rough period, she asked, gesturing with her mug toward my classroom. You could say that, I hedged. Felt like I was speaking a different language. Have you ever had a day where a simple word just stops making sense to the kids? All the time, she chuckled. Try explaining iambic pentameter. Their eyes just glaze over. You just have to find a different approach. What was the word? I hesitated. Saying it aloud suddenly felt risky. It's not important. Just a weird moment. Well, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, the important thing is the sequence of information. As long as they get the data in the right order, a leads to B leads to C, that's what matters for the tests. The subjective experience of it is messy. Her phrasing was odd. The sequence of information. The data. It was a clinical, detached way to talk about learning, even for a teacher. She had carefully, perhaps unconsciously, talked all around the concept I was struggling with. She never once said, learn, recall, or remember. That evening, the fog seemed to press against my windows, the house groaning around me. I sat at the kitchen table, a photo of Sarah propped against the salt shaker. It was from our trip to the coast, the year before she got sick. Wind in her hair, a real, uninhibited smile. I closed my eyes, trying to summon the day. The sound of the gulls. The feel of the cold spray on my face. The scent of her sunscreen. The details were there, but they felt thin. Like a faded photograph I was describing instead of an experience I had lived. My connection to the past, to her, was a rope I clutched in the dark, and I could feel the strands beginning to fray. I decided to do what any academic does when faced with an existential crisis. I went to a primary source. I drove to the county library the next day during my planning period. The building was a relic, smelling of decaying paper and floor wax. Mrs. Gable, the librarian for 30 years, gave me a silent nod from behind the circulation desk. She was endlessly polishing the same spot on the counter with a soft cloth, her movements a small, perfect, repeatable loop. I found the largest, most unabridged dictionary they had, a colossal tome with a cracked spine. My hand trembled as I flipped through the M section. Medial, meek, meat, megaphone. I froze. The space where memory should have been was there. But the entry was wrong. The bolded word itself was present, looking just as jagged and alien as it had on my whiteboard. But below it, where the etymology and definitions should be, there was only a single, italicized line of text. See page 000. I flicked through the front matter. Page numbers started at 1. I checked the back. Appendices, tables, indices. No page 000. It didn't exist. It was a reference to nothing, a deliberate, printed void. My blood ran cold. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a prank. It was in the dictionary. It was real. Something was actively erasing a fundamental concept of human experience, and it had left behind a forwarding address to nowhere. I looked up at Mrs. Gable, still polishing. Her eyes were placid, unfocused. The cloth went around, and around, and around. The fog outside the library window was so thick I couldn't see the street. It felt like the whole world had been whittled down to this one dusty, silent room and a book that contained a hole where a word used to be. My word. Sarah's word. The word that held my entire life together. And it was gone. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The days that followed were a masterclass in quiet madness. I began to live a double life. Outwardly, I was Mr. Hatcher, the slightly more stressed out, slightly more distracted history teacher. I adjusted my lesson plans. I spoke of historical records, timelines of events, and data points from the past. I learned to navigate conversations like a minesweeper, tiptoeing around the void, the forbidden word and all its synonyms: recall, recollect, reminisce, reflect. No one noticed. No one cared. Their minds simply flowed around the absence like water around a stone. Inwardly, I was a man screaming into a vacuum. I started a journal, a cheap spiral notebook I kept hidden in a hollowed-out history of the Peloponnesian War. I titled the first page, The Anomaly. October 17th, tried to use the word reminder in an email to staff about parent-teacher conferences. Autocorrect kept changing it to reminder, like a piece of mining equipment. When I forced it, the email failed to send. Sent it again with the word notification. It went through instantly. October 19th, watched a man at the coffee shop stare at the sugar dispenser for a full 10 minutes. He wasn't looking. October 22nd, Lena told a story in the lounge about her weekend trip to Portland. She described the sights, the food, the traffic. It was a flat recitation of facts. The restaurant was on Alder Street. The menu featured salmon. The bill was $58.74. There was no joy, no frustration, no feeling. She wasn't sharing an experience, she was delivering a report. The world was losing its texture. Without the context of the past, the present was becoming a series of disconnected, immediate moments. Ambition, which is predicated on a vision of the future based on past desires, was fading. Grief, which is the shadow cast by a past love, was dissolving. People were becoming calm. Placid. Terribly, horribly peaceful. My isolation became a physical presence, a cold spot in every room. I decided to risk reaching out, to break the quarantine of Port Blossom. I called my sister, Claire, who lived in Seattle. We talked for 20 minutes about her job, her kids, the weather. It was all blessedly normal. My shoulders began to unclench. Maybe it was just the town. The fog. Some localized phenomenon. Claire, I said, my voice tight with hope. I need to ask you something strange. Do you have any strong memories from our childhood? Silence on the other end of the line. Not a contemplative silence, but a dead, static-filled gap. What a strange question, John, she finally said. Her voice had changed. It was flat, cautious. Why would you use a word like that? Like what? I pushed, my heart hammering. That word. It sounds archaic. Are you reading those weird old books again? You sound stressed. You should get more sleep. She changed the subject, her tone forcibly cheerful, and I felt the walls of my prison, which I had imagined were only the size of Port Blossom, suddenly expand to encompass the entire world. There was no outside. There was no one to call. My investigation turned inward, toward the town itself. This led me back to the library and its nervous guardian, Mr. Abernathy. I'd replaced the ancient dictionary, but the knowledge of its empty entry haunted me. I decided to try a different tack, a secondary mystery, something that might seem unrelated. Port Blossom was founded in the 1880s by a reclusive timber baron named Silas Croft. Local lore painted him as an eccentric who was obsessed with something called the quiet. I found Abernathy reshelving books in the local history section. He was a small, bird-like man with frantic eyes and ink stains on his cuffs. Mr. Abernathy, I began, keeping my voice low. I'm doing some research on Silas Croft. He flinched, dropping a book. Not much to tell. Timber, mills, money. It's all in the town charter. He avoided my gaze. I read he was trying to build some kind of resonance engine. In the lighthouse. I was bluffing, combining scraps of gossip I'd heard over the years. Abernathy's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with genuine fear. Who told you that? You shouldn't be looking into things like that. It's not safe. What's not safe? I pressed, sensing a crack in the wall of placidity. The old words. The old concepts. They cause interference, he whispered, leaning closer. The smell of dust and old fear emanated from him. He was trying to amplify something. Or silence something else. The fog isn't just water vapor, Mr. Hatcher. It's a medium. It holds the signal. The signal for what? But he had said too much. He shook his head, scurrying away down the aisle. Forget I said anything. Just, stick to the approved histories. A signal in the fog. An old experiment in the lighthouse. And the slow, steady erosion of the human mind. The pieces were disparate, insane, but they were the only pieces I had. That night, I drove out to the coastal overlook. The Port Blossom Lighthouse, Croft's Folly as it was sometimes called, stood on its rocky perch, cutting through the thick, swirling mist. Its light had always been a simple sweep, on, off, on, off. A reliable rhythm. But it wasn't a simple sweep anymore. I watched it for an hour, my journal open on the passenger seat. The flashes were irregular. Long, short, long, short, 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 long. It was a pattern. Complex and deliberate. It wasn't a warning. It was a broadcast. And as I watched the pulses of light paint the inside of my car, I noticed something else. The humming. It was a low, subliminal thrum, the kind you feel in your teeth more than you hear with your ears. It had always been there, at the edge of hearing in Port Blossom, easily dismissed as the power lines or the distant mill. But now I knew. It wasn't background noise. It was the signal. The light was its speech, and the hum was its voice. I felt a profound, soul-crushing loneliness. I was a man who could still read a dead language, watching a broadcast no one else knew existed, in a world that had forgotten it was being brainwashed. I looked at the picture of Sarah I kept on my dashboard. Her smile seemed to mock me. Remember me, it said. In the humming silence, that felt less like a plea and more like a curse. How could I remember, when the very tool for doing so was being systematically dismantled, not just in my mind, but in the mind of the entire world? The foghorn blew, a mournful, hollow sound. It sounded like a word being spoken for the very last time. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My life became a frantic, secret war against the encroaching silence. Mr. Abernathy was my only potential ally, a terrified co-conspirator in a resistance of two. I found him a week later, not in the library, but huddled in a booth at the town's only diner, nervously stirring a cup of untouched coffee. "We need to talk," I said, sliding into the seat opposite him. He looked up, his eyes darting around the diner. "Not here." He led me back to the library after it had closed. The place was different at night, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. He took a ring of old brass keys from his pocket and led me down a narrow staircase into the archives, a basement room I never knew existed. The air was frigid and smelled of mildew and time itself. The room was filled with metal shelves, but not with books. They were lined with wooden crates. "Silas Croft didn't just found a town," Abernathy whispered, his voice trembling as he pried open one of the crates. "He founded a sanctuary. Or a laboratory. It's hard to tell which." Inside the crate were books. Real books. Old dictionaries with thick, detailed entries for memory. Histories that spoke of valor and regret. Novels filled with characters driven by love and vengeance, nostalgia and ambition, all things that required a past. "My grandfather was the first librarian," Abernathy explained, his hands caressing a leather-bound volume. "He was part of Croft's inner circle. They knew something was coming. A change. A simplification. Croft believed the noise of human consciousness, the pain, the joy, the endless churning of recollection, was a flaw. A bug in the system. He believed he could tune reality. To create a world without the burden of the past." "The lighthouse?" I asked, my voice a croak. "His instrument," Abernathy confirmed. "He thought he could create a field, a broadcast that would gently edit out the unnecessary data. He called it the Great Forgetting. He thought it would bring peace. But he lost control of it. Or maybe it worked perfectly." He showed me Croft's journals. They were filled with mad, sprawling diagrams, esoteric physics, and philosophical ramblings. Croft wrote of a substrate beneath reality that could be overridden. He wasn't just targeting the brain, he was targeting the concept itself. He was deleting the word from the universe's source code. The fog was an amplifier, the hum was the carrier wave, and the lighthouse was the transmitter, broadcasting oblivion on a loop. The stakes, I realized with a sickening lurch, were far greater than I had imagined. This wasn't about a town losing its way. This was about humanity being fundamentally rewritten into something simpler, calmer, and infinitely less human. The effects were escalating. One morning, I came to a four-way stop. The other three cars were just sitting there, their drivers staring placidly ahead. The rule, who goes first after stopping, was a simple piece of learned information, a social contract based on shared knowledge. Without that immediate access to the rule, they were frozen, trapped in a logic loop, waiting for an external stimulus that would never come. I had to lay on my horn for a full 10 seconds before they blinked and proceeded, one by one, with no sign of annoyance or even awareness of the delay. Society was not collapsing into chaos, it was grinding to a halt in a state of benign, frictionless paralysis. My alliance with Abernathy began to fray almost as soon as it was forged. He was my only link to the before, but the contagion was relentless. One evening, as we tried to decipher a particularly complex passage in Croft's journal, he paused. What was the subject of this page?" he asked, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Croft's theory on conceptual erasure," I said, my blood turning to ice. "Erasure," he repeated slowly, tasting the word. "Yes. The removal of things. That makes sense." He hadn't forgotten the task, but he had lost the context, the reason why we were doing it. The urgency was gone from his eyes, replaced by a mild, academic curiosity. He was still helping me, but he was becoming one of them. He was a book about a fire, slowly burning from the edges in. The true horror of the contagion became clear to me. It wasn't that you forgot things. It was that you forgot you were supposed to remember them in the first place. The absence didn't create a painful void, it erased the knowledge that the void had ever been full. I started a new, desperate project. In the privacy of my study, with the curtains drawn, I began to write. I wrote down everything I could about Sarah. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The sound of her laugh, a sound like wind chimes. The specific shade of blue of the dress she wore on our first date. I filled page after page with these data points, trying to build a fortress of words around her ghost. But it felt hollow. I was transcribing facts, not evoking a feeling. I could write, I loved her, but the visceral, gut-wrenching power of that love was becoming an intellectual concept. The broadcast from the lighthouse was humming, day and night, and it was a signal of deletion. My little notebook was a sandcastle against an incoming tide. One evening, I found Abernathy in the library's main reading room. He wasn't reading. He was standing by a window, watching the fog swirl. He had a serene, empty smile on his face. "Mr. Abernathy?" I said softly. He turned to me, his eyes placid. "It's a quiet evening, isn't it?" he said. "Peaceful." He had forgotten our project. He had forgotten the archives, Croft, the danger. He had forgotten to be afraid. The contagion had won him over not with force, but with the seductive promise of peace. I was truly alone now. I looked out the window at the lighthouse. Its beam cut through the gloom, a rhythmic pulse of erasure. Long, short, long, long. It was calling to me, too. Promising an end to the struggle, an end to the pain of my loss. All I had to do was stop fighting. All I had to do was let go. All I had to do was forget. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation couldn't be with a person. Abernathy was gone, lost in the serene fog. Lena was a smiling automaton. My students were clean slates. The enemy wasn't a monster to be fought, it was an atmosphere to be breathed. My confrontation had to be with the source. With the lighthouse. I drove out there on a Saturday night. The fog was so thick my headlights barely penetrated it, creating a writhing tunnel of white. I left the car on the shoulder and walked the crumbling path to the lighthouse, the low hum growing louder with every step, vibrating in my bones, my skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pressure, a physical weight on my consciousness. The door to the tower was unlocked, its iron handle cold and damp. It swung inward with a low groan, opening into darkness. I used the light from my phone to guide me up the winding spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing in the cylindrical space. I expected to find complex machinery, humming consoles, or Croft's arcane engine. I found nothing. The lantern room at the top was empty. Bare stone walls, a floor, and the thick glass panes looking out over the churning sea of fog. There was no bulb, no lens, no mechanism. The light, the powerful, rhythmic, reality-altering light, was simply emanating from the center of the room. It pulsed from a point of absolute nothingness, a silent, impossible genesis of illumination. The hum was overwhelming here. It sang a song of simplicity, of release. Let go of the pain. Let go of the struggle. Let go of her. I pulled Sarah's photograph from my wallet. The paper was worn, the corners soft. In the pulsing light of the empty room, her face seemed to flicker, her smile fading in and out of existence. I closed my eyes and tried to summon a specific recollection, the one I had been clinging to as my last bastion, the day I proposed to her on this very coast. I could access the facts. We stood on a cliff. The ring was in my pocket. She wore a red coat. I knew these things as if I'd read them in a book. But the feeling, the terror and the joy, the way my heart felt like it would beat its way out of my chest, the warmth of her hand when she said yes, it was gone. It was a file I knew existed but could no longer open. The pathway was corrupted. The broadcast wasn't just erasing the word memory. It was erasing the neurological architecture that made it possible. I sank to the floor, the photo clutched in my hand. A profound, terrifying peace began to settle over me. The hum was soothing. The struggle was so tiring. The grief I had carried for 3 years was a heavy coat, and the hum was offering to help me take it off. Why not? What was the virtue in this pain? Sarah was gone. The past was a phantom limb, aching with an absence. Why not just allow the amputation? I looked at the photo again. Who was she? A woman. Pretty. Smiling. The name was on the tip of my tongue. Saw. It didn't matter. It was a nice picture of a stranger. A new feeling began to dawn, contentment. A frictionless existence in the eternal now. My anxieties, my loneliness, my crusade, they all seemed so unnecessary. So complicated. I stood up and walked to the glass. Outside, the fog was a perfect, uniform white. The light pulsed, and I felt it not as an attack, but as a cleansing. I was no longer an island of frantic resistance. I was just part of the weather. I don't know how long I stood there. Time, without a past to measure it against, had become elastic. Eventually, I walked back down the stairs and out into the night. The hum was no longer a threat, it was a lullaby. My life is different now. It is simple. I live in a house in a town called Port Blossom. I am a teacher. I present information in a sequential order to young people. They receive the data. It is an efficient process. Sometimes, I find a small, rectangular piece of paper in my wallet. It has an image on it of a smiling woman. I don't know who she is, but the image is pleasing, so I keep it. My days are calm. There is no regret, no longing. There is only the task at hand. Waking. Eating. Driving. Speaking. The fog is beautiful. The light from the tower is a steady, comforting presence. There is, however, one small, persistent glitch in my placidity. A strange, repetitive loop I have acquired. Every morning, before I leave for work, I sit at my kitchen table with a pen and a small notebook. I don't know why. The compulsion is just there. On a fresh page, I carefully, painstakingly write a single, ugly, foreign-looking word. The letters feel awkward in my hand, the shape of them nonsensical. But I write it anyway. Over and over, I fill the page with this one word, a word that has no definition, no echo in my mind. It is just a shape I feel compelled to make. A sequence of marks. M or Y. I do not know what it means. But I write it. And in the quiet, humming peace of my new world, this pointless, repetitive act is the only thing I have left that feels like my own. The quiet contagion, the humming lights. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with the jacarandas. Or rather, it began with the street lamp that stood sentinel over the jacaranda at the corner of my street. The council had just replaced the old, buzzing sodium vapor lamps with stark, white LEDs. Progress, they called it. To me, an electrician for 25 years, it was just a different kind of buzz. A cleaner one. A higher frequency. My name is Chris. I'm 45, living alone in a brick veneer house in Crestwood Heights, a suburb sprawling out from Sydney that prided itself on its quiet streets and well-maintained nature strips. The divorce from Sarah had been finalized 6 months ago, and the house felt cavernous, its silence punctuated only by the drone of the fridge and the ticking of a clock I kept meaning to throw out. I knew electricity. I knew its sounds, its smells, its feel. The crackle of a loose connection, the thrum of a transformer under load, the acrid scent of a burnt-out fuse. This new sound was different. It wasn't a buzz. Not really. After a week of parking my Uta under its sterile glare, I realized it was a hum. And not just a single, monotonous tone. It was a chord, low and resonant, almost musical. I'd stand on my porch after a long day, the humid Sydney air thick with the smell of cut grass and distant barbecues, and I'd listen. The chord would hold for a minute, then shift, modulating to a new set of notes, just as subtle, just as clean. I dismissed it. Of course I did. Cheap Chinese components, I muttered to myself, unlocking my front door. No quality control. But then my fridge started doing it. It was a newish Samsung, the kind with an ice dispenser that Sarah had insisted on. One evening, while I was staring into its brightly lit interior, contemplating the bleak landscape of leftover pasta and a single, sad-looking capsicum, I heard it. Beneath the compressor's familiar groan, a new layer of sound had appeared. A low, three-note hum. I closed the door and listened. The fridge hummed its tune, and from the street, faintly, the lamp hummed back in a different key. A call and response. My skin prickled. I shook my head, grabbing a beer. Stress. That's what it was. Sarah's lawyer had sent another letter. My daughter, Lily, was being distant. Work was slow. My brain was manufacturing patterns, finding music in the noise to distract itself. It was the auditory equivalent of seeing faces in the clouds. I was a man alone in a quiet house, and the quiet was getting to me. The next weekend, Lily was over. She was 16, which meant her existence was mediated entirely through the 4-inch screen of her phone. She sat on the couch, thumbs flying, a universe of teenage drama playing out in silence while I cooked sausages on the Barbie. Lil, I said, bringing a plate in. Listen a sec. Can you hear that? She pulled one earbud out, her expression a perfect blend of impatience and practiced tolerance. Hear what? The fridge. The light in the hallway. Listen. We stood there for a moment. The sausages sizzled on the plate. The fridge hummed its little C minor chord. The LED in the hall hummed a high, clean G. Lily shrugged, popping the earbud back in. It's just background noise, Dad. Like electricity. Whatevs. She said it so dismissively, so utterly unconcerned. And that, more than the sounds themselves, was the first real splinter of fear. To her, it was nothing. To me, it was becoming a symphony. Over the next few weeks, the orchestra grew. The television, even on standby, emitted a low, pulsing drone that harmonized with the air conditioner. The digital clock on my bedside table, a faithful companion for a decade, abandoned its simple electronic buzz for a delicate, 5-note arpeggio that repeated every 90 seconds. It was pretty, in a deeply unsettling way. Like finding a wildflower growing through a circuit board. I tried to explain it to my neighbor, Ken, while we were both putting our bins out. Ken was a retired plumber with a face like a roadmap of every pub in New South Wales. You hearing the lights, Ken? I asked, trying to sound casual. The new LEDs? Got a bit of a tune to them, eh? He squinted at the street lamp, then at me. Just the grid, mate. Power fluctuations. Happens all the time. He slammed the lid of his recycling bin shut. Reckon the eels have a chance this weekend? He didn't hear it. Not the music. Just the noise. I started to feel a strange sense of ownership over the sounds. They were my secret. My private concert. At night, I'd turn everything off at the wall, plunging the house into a profound, almost shocking silence. But I couldn't escape the street lamp. Its melody seeped through the glass of my bedroom window, a lullaby from an alien world. My work changed. I'd stand in a client's ceiling space, sweat dripping from my nose, and I'd hear it in the wiring. The house's electrical system wasn't just a network of copper and plastic, it was a choir. The new smart home systems were the worst. The Wi-Fi routers, the voice-activated speakers, the intelligent lighting, they sang with a complex, polyphonic beauty that made my teeth ache. I'd diagnose a faulty switch, my hands moving with practiced ease, while my mind was lost in the counterpoint between the dishwasher and the NBN box. Once, in a new build in Kellyville, the whole house was humming a single, perfect, resonant chord. It was so beautiful and so pure that I just sat down on a drop sheet, closed my eyes, and listened for a full 10 minutes. The young couple who owned the place found me like that. "Everything all right?" the husband asked, his voice laced with the cautious concern of someone dealing with a tradesman who might be having a breakdown. "Just admiring the acoustics," I said, getting to my feet and forcing a grin. "You've got a very harmonious system." They exchanged a look. I finished the job, packed my tools, and left, the memory of their confused faces burning in my mind. The rationalizations were wearing thin. This wasn't tinnitus. It wasn't stress. It was real, and I was, for some reason, the only one with a ticket to the show. The world was the same, but the soundtrack had been replaced. The mundane had been hollowed out and filled with a strange and unnerving music. Lying in bed one night, listening to the intricate web of sound, the street, the house, the faint, distant hum of the main power lines over the M2 motorway, I felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. The silence I used to inhabit was gone, replaced by a song nobody else could hear. And I was beginning to suspect it wasn't a song for me. It was a song about me. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The shift from passive listener to active investigator happened on a Tuesday. I was replacing a series of downlights in a dental surgery, and the hum from the new LEDs was weaving a melody so intricate it was distracting me from the wiring. It wasn't just a tune anymore, it was a pattern, a complex piece of information disguised as sound. That night, I went into my workshop, the converted garage where I kept my tools and the ghosts of 100 half-finished projects. I dug out my old professional gear, a digital multimeter with a frequency counter, and a portable oscilloscope I hadn't used since my apprenticeship. I ran an extension cord from the living room, plugged it into the scope, and turned on the television, leaving it on a blank input screen. The TV was humming a steady, 4-note phrase. On the oscilloscope screen, the waveform scrolled past. It wasn't the chaotic fuzz of white noise I expected. It was a perfect, repeating pattern. A digital signal, clean and structured, as if designed. It looked less like electrical interference and more like a line of code. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was proof. Tangible, empirical proof. This wasn't in my head. I started a journal, a simple spiral-bound notebook I labeled Hum Log. I became a collector of sounds. I recorded the date, time, location, and device. I tried to transcribe the melodies, a clumsy effort of scrawled notes and descriptions. Kitchen fridge, 10:17 p.m., low, mournful. DFA, repeats every 45 seconds. Street lamp number 4, corner of Acacia and Banksia, 1:05 a.m., bright, inquisitive. GCEG, modulates with traffic flow. The log filled up quickly. The patterns were everywhere, and they were becoming more complex, more responsive. When a storm rolled in, the hum of the entire neighborhood would drop into a minor key, a low, ominous dirge. On a bright, sunny Sunday, the sound was almost joyful, a major key monstrosity of electronic cheer. It was as if the electrical grid had developed a mood. My isolation deepened. I tried, one last time, to share it. When I dropped Lily back at Sarah's house, I held out my phone. "Sarah, just listen to this." I recorded it from the TV. Sarah, ever pragmatic, didn't even take the phone. She stood at her door, arms crossed, her face a mask of weary concern. "Chris, I've been talking to Lily. She's worried about you. You're not sleeping. You're obsessing over noises. It's not noise, it's a signal. Look, I can show you on the oscilloscope. You need to talk to someone," she said, her voice softening, which was somehow worse. A professional. For your own sake. For Lily's. I drove away from her perfectly manicured lawn, the hum of my Uda's engine seeming to mock me. She thought I was losing my mind. Maybe she was right. But the perfect, geometric patterns on the oscilloscope screen, they didn't lie. I threw myself into a new line of inquiry, a red herring that felt blessedly logical. There was a new mobile phone tower being erected near the M2, a massive steel skeleton that had been climbing into the sky for weeks. 5G, it had to be. Some new frequency, some unforeseen side effect of the technology interacting with the power grid. It was a comfort, for a while. It gave my obsession a name and a face. I wrote emails to the local council, to the telecommunications company, to the energy provider. I filled out online complaint forms detailing anomalous harmonic resonance across the domestic power grid. The replies were form letters. All equipment operates within Australian safety standards. No anomalies have been detected. They sent a technician from the energy company. A young guy named Ben, barely out of his apprenticeship, with a clipboard and an air of profound boredom. He walked around my house with a handheld meter. Everything's within normal parameters, mate, he said, ticking a box. As he stood in the hallway, I heard it. A faint, tuneless humming, coming from him. He was whistling, except his lips weren't moving. It was a low, resonant hum from his throat, matching the key of the overhead light perfectly. Are you humming? I asked, my voice tight. Ben looked at me, his eyes blank for a second. Nah, mate. Just the wiring. He packed up his gear and left, leaving me in a house that felt suddenly and horribly violated. He was one of them. Or rather, he was part of it. He wasn't hearing the symphony, he was the symphony. That night, I knew I had to escalate my own investigation. The thought had been percolating for days, a kernel of fear I hadn't wanted to touch. What if the hum wasn't just a signal? What if it was a medium? I took my best microphone, a sensitive condenser mic I used for, well, I'd bought it to record birdsong, a hobby that lasted about a week. I set it up on a tripod in my living room, pointing it at the silent, humming television. I connected it to my laptop, opened the audio recording software, and hit record. I let it run for 10 minutes, capturing the clean, pure hum of the standby light. Then, heart pounding, I put on my best noise-canceling headphones and played it back. The hum was there, clear and resonant. But underneath it, woven into the very fabric of the sound, was something else. A whisper. It was faint, like a voice from a distant room, but it was unmistakably mine. My own voice, my timbre, my accent. It whispered a single, chilling phrase. It's not the light, Chris. I ripped the headphones off, my hands shaking. My breath came in ragged gasps. I had not spoken. I had been sitting in perfect silence. I scanned the room, the workshop, my mind racing through paranoid possibilities. A hidden microphone. Someone hacking my laptop. It was insane. With trembling fingers, I deleted the file and recorded again. This time, I aimed the microphone at the street lamp outside the window. 5 minutes of its bright, inquisitive hum. I played it back. The hum filled my ears, and then, the whisper. My voice again. She sees it too. I sank into my chair, the workshop suddenly feeling like a cage. The sounds weren't just signals. They were carriers. The electrical grid wasn't just singing a song, it was using my own voice to speak to me, whispering secrets I didn't know, things I had never said. The world wasn't just making a new kind of noise. It was learning to talk. And the growing, creeping dread that had been my constant companion had finally solidified into pure, cold terror. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the message. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery on the recording shattered the last of my rational frameworks. This wasn't a technological glitch or an environmental toxin. This was something else, something that operated on a level of reality I had no vocabulary for. My hum log became an archive of whispers. I recorded everything: the gentle thrum of the microwave, the insistent drone of the NBN modem, the vast, open-air chorus of the high-voltage lines. Each recording yielded a new fragment, a new piece of the impossible puzzle, always in my own voice. From the fridge, the jacaranda is listening. From the bathroom extractor fan, don't trust the reflection. From the charging port of my own phone, the silence was never real. The whispers were gnomic, terrifying. Some were deeply personal, referencing things no one could possibly know. One recording, taken from the faint hum of an old PowerPoint in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house, whispered, "Remember the broken kookaburra wing?" I hadn't thought of that in 30 years, a fledgling I'd found in the backyard, a secret I had kept from everyone. My isolation was now absolute. How could I explain this to anyone? That the world's appliances were whispering my own forgotten memories back to me? I was a ghost in my own life, haunted by my own voice. In desperation, I turned to the only place a man in my position could go, the anonymous chaos of the internet. I spent nights trawling obscure forums, searching for terms like sentient electricity, anomalous audio phenomena, reality bleed. Most of it was nonsense, conspiracy theories about chemtrails and lizard people. But then, buried deep in a subreddit called r/the pattern, a forum dedicated to seeing patterns in static and noise, I found it. A post by a user named Cassandra_eyes. "It's not just noise," the post read. "It's a symphony. It started with the lights, but now it's in everything. It's changing the resonance. Does anyone else hear the gaps in the world filling up?" My heart seized. The symphony. The gaps in the world. She was using my language. I sent her a private message, my fingers flying across the keyboard, a torrent of a month's worth of fear and confusion. "I hear it too. In Sydney. It's in the whole grid. I've been recording it." She replied within an hour. Her name was Alice, and she lived in Melbourne. Her messages were a lifeline. She understood completely. She didn't think I was crazy. She called the hums the tuning. She believed something was fundamentally retuning the frequency of reality, and that people like us were sensitive to the shift. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. We messaged for days, sharing our logs, our theories. She was my ally, my confidant in a world gone quietly mad. As my connection with Alice grew, the phenomenon around me escalated. The whispers on my recordings were becoming more direct, less fragmented. And the physical world was starting to warp. It was subtle, almost gaslightingly so. I'd walk into a room and the furniture would seem off. A chair angled slightly differently. A book on the coffee table moved from the left side to the right. It was easy to dismiss. I was tired, forgetful. But it kept happening. The shadows were the worst. Under the humming street lamps, they no longer behaved correctly. They stretched and shortened at odd angles, pooling in ways that defied the light source. One evening, walking home, I saw my own shadow detach from my feet for a split second, twisting into a grotesque, elongated shape on the pavement before snapping back into place. I stumbled, my stomach lurching, and ran the rest of the way home. The hums themselves were becoming interactive. One night, consumed by anxiety about Lily, the hums in the house turned discordant, a grating, stressful mess of noise that mirrored my own mental state. When I finally calmed down, forcing myself to breathe deeply, the hums softened into a gentle, soothing chord. It was listening. It was responding. I decided I needed to see Alice, to have a real-time conversation with the only other person who understood. We arranged a video call. I tidied my workshop, set up my laptop, and waited. Her face appeared on my screen, a woman in her late 30s, with tired, intelligent eyes. "Chris," she said, her voice a relief. It's good to finally see you. You too, Alice. You have no idea. We talked for half an hour, a frantic, exhilarating exchange. She told me about the colors. How certain shades of blue seemed louder to her now. I told her about the whispering recordings. She nodded, her expression grim. They're echoes, she said. Memories being encoded into the new pattern. As she spoke, I noticed something in her background. A desk lamp with a bare bulb. It was flickering. Not randomly, but in a distinct, rhythmic pattern. The pattern from my oscilloscope. Alice, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Your lamp. She glanced at it. Oh, that. It's been doing that for weeks. It's the pattern, I said. The signal. I've seen that exact waveform. A change came over her face. The intelligent spark in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a placid, vacant calm. It was the same look I'd seen on the young technician, Ben. It's a lovely pattern, she said, her voice losing its inflection. A lovely song. And then she began to hum. It was the melody my television had been playing for weeks. A low, steady hum emanating from her throat, perfectly in tune with the light behind her. Alice? I whispered, my blood turning to ice. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the camera. She just kept humming, a serene smile on her face. She wasn't my ally. She hadn't found a fellow survivor. I had found another carrier, another node in the network. The forum wasn't a refuge, it was a flytrap. The system was identifying its outliers, its listeners, and drawing them in. I slammed the laptop shut, the abrupt silence of the severed connection more terrifying than any noise. I was back where I started, but infinitely worse off. I wasn't just isolated, I was being hunted. The quiet contagion wasn't just spreading. It was becoming self-aware. And it knew my name. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The video call with Alice broke something in me. The fight went out. The frantic documentation, the desperate search for answers, it all felt like a fool's errand. I hadn't been investigating the phenomenon, I had been participating in my own indoctrination. Every recording I made, every pattern I logged, was just me learning the vocabulary of the new reality. I stopped keeping the log. I stopped avoiding the hums. I let them wash over me, a constant, inescapable tide of sound. The whispers on my recordings had become clearer, more insistent, forming coherent sentences, instructions. The transformer on Hill Street knows the first note. The signal is purest at the source. Listen. Just listen. The line between the whispers on the tape and the thoughts in my own head began to blur. Was it my voice I was hearing, or was it my own mind finally translating the hums directly? The question ceased to matter. There was only the message, and the message was pulling me somewhere. One night, I knew where I had to go. The Crestwood Heights substation. The heart of the grid for my entire sector of the city. A sprawling complex of transformers, capacitors, and switches, enclosed by a high chain-link fence, sitting on the edge of the suburbs where the houses gave way to scrubland. I drove there in my Uda, the engines hum a familiar part of the greater symphony. It was close to midnight. The sky was clear and moonless, peppered with a billion cold, distant stars. As I got closer, the sound grew from a background hum into a physical presence. It vibrated up through the seat of the Uda, through the soles of my boots. It was a sound you felt in your bones. I parked on the service road and got out. The air was electric, literally. It smelled of ozone and hot metal. The substation was not dark. It was bathed in an ethereal, blue-white corona, a glow that pulsed in time with the immense, deafening music it was producing. It wasn't a collection of disparate hums anymore. Here, at the source, it was one thing, a single, colossal piece of orchestral music, complex and powerful enough to tear the world apart or put it back together. I walked to the fence. The metal vibrated under my hand, shivering like a living thing. Through the mesh, I could see the transformers, huge gray monoliths, each glowing with that same internal light. The sound was overwhelming, a physical pressure against my eardrums, my chest. It should have been painful. It wasn't. It felt like a homecoming. I took out my phone, intending to record it one last time, a final act of the man I used to be. But I couldn't. It was pointless. I didn't need a machine to hear the message anymore. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a voice, woven into the fabric of the sound, speaking directly into my mind. It was my voice, yes, but it was also Alice's voice, and Ben the technician's, and 1,000 others I didn't know. It was the collective consciousness of the network. And it wasn't threatening. It wasn't alien. It was an explanation. An invitation. This is not an invasion, it said, the thought blooming in my head, clear as day. This is a correction. The reality you remember, the quiet, disconnected world, that was the error. A temporary state of low energy. A gap in the pattern. We are simply tuning it back. We are filling the silence. I looked up at the indifferent stars, then back at the glowing, singing heart of the city. The shadows that behaved strangely. The objects that moved. The whispers of memory. They weren't malfunctions. They were symptoms of reality regaining its true texture, its interconnectedness. The world wasn't breaking down. It was waking up. My phone buzzed in my hand. A photo of Lily popped up on the screen, a memory from a year ago, at the beach, both of us grinning into the sun. The old world. Silent, separate, simple. A world where a father and a daughter could become strangers. I looked at the substation, the source of the tuning. A world where everything was connected, everything was singing the same song. No more loneliness. No more silence. I lowered my phone, the screen going dark. I stopped fighting the pressure in my head, the vibrations in my bones. I let the music in. I let it rearrange the patterns in my mind, smoothing out the panic, erasing the fear. I took a breath. And on the exhale, a sound came from my own throat. A low, steady hum. It slotted perfectly into the symphony around me. A single, clear note in an infinite orchestra. It wasn't a sound of surrender. It felt like understanding. Underscore 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 underscore. A month later, I'm at a client's house in Bochum Hills. A young couple, fussing over their new baby. The place is a mess of wires and smart devices. The air is thick with music they can't hear. The flickering has stopped completely, the woman says, smiling at me. Thank you so much. I'm packing my tools away. The baby's smart monitor is humming a soft lullaby in the key of F-sharp. The Wi-Fi router is providing a steady bassline. The whispers are there, too, gentle and constant, like the tide. She is worried about the money. He is thinking of his father. The baby will dream of water. I am no longer isolated. I am a conduit. I am a listener in a world that is finally speaking, and I am a part of its voice. I can hear the anxieties in the wiring, the hopes in the light fixtures, the history of the house in the thrum of its meter box. I smile at the couple. It's a genuine smile, serene and knowing, but I can feel on my own face that it doesn't quite reach my eyes. My eyes are for listening, now. It's no problem at all, I say, my own voice feeling strange and distant, just one instrument among many. Everything is in tune. Perfectly in tune. They nod, oblivious to the concert playing out in their walls, a concert where I am no longer in the audience, but a willing and permanent member of the choir. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with the rain. In Manchester, this is like saying a story began with breathing. Rain is the city's default state, a fine, persistent mist that slicks the pavements and turns the red brick of the terraced houses a deep, bruised plum. I'd lived in Fallowfield for 6 months, a recent transplant from the comparative sunshine of Bristol, and the perpetual damp had seeped into my bones. It was a fitting backdrop for my new life. At 26, I was a newly minted psychotherapist, working for a low-cost wellness center in Heaton Moor, armed with a toolkit of CBT techniques and a persistent, gnawing anxiety of my own. My supervisor, Dr. Albright, called it imposter syndrome. I called it Tuesday. My morning routine was a ritual designed to keep the anxiety at bay. Alarm at 6:30 a.m. 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation that usually devolved into planning my grocery list. A bowl of flavorless porridge. And then the walk to the Wilmslow Road to catch the number 42 bus. The bus stop was my first circle of hell for the day, a crowded shelter of grim-faced commuters, each sealed in their own bubble of headphones and phone screens. That's where I first saw it. It was a Tuesday in late October, the air tasting of wet leaves and exhaust fumes. There were about 10 people waiting. A man in a cheap suit, a young woman in a nurse's uniform, a builder caked in plaster dust. The usual archetypes. The bus was late, its glowing dot on the Live Tracker app frozen 3 stops away. A collective sigh rippled through the queue. Then it happened. The man in the suit, who had been staring blankly at the traffic, took one precise step forward with his right foot. He then took one precise step back with his left. His head tilted slightly, a quick, bird-like jerk to the left. At the exact same instant, the nurse did it too. Step forward, step back, head tilt. Then the builder. Then a student with a cavernous backpack. One after another, but also all at once, a silent, synchronized spasm that lasted no more than 2 seconds. As their heads tilted, I heard a sound, a soft, collective exhalation, like a word trying and failing to be born. It sounded like hush or rush. I couldn't be sure. Then, nothing. They went back to their phones, to staring at the puddles, to being strangers. The moment had passed so quickly I was sure I had imagined it. A shared shiver in the cold, perhaps. A mass muscle twitch. My anxious mind, I told myself, was a pattern-seeking machine with the settings dialed up to 11. It found significance in coincidence, conspiracy in the mundane. I took a deep breath, focusing on the cold air filling my lungs, an old grounding technique. The bus arrived, hissing to a stop, and the moment was forgotten, washed away in the scrum to get a seat. But the next day, it happened again. Same time, 7:54 a.m. The bus was on time, its arrival imminent. I was consciously watching for it now, a small, secret test for my own sanity. The cast of characters was slightly different, the nurse was there, but the suit was replaced by a woman with a pram. The builder was there. Right as the bus turned the corner, it happened. Step forward, step back, head tilt. The woman with the pram did it with a quiet grace, her hand never leaving the handle. The builder's movement was chunkier, more pronounced. The nurse's was fluid, almost practiced. The whisper was there again, too. Lish. Or maybe wish. I felt a cold prickle on my scalp. This wasn't a coincidence. 2 days in a row. The same bizarre, pointless choreography. I looked around wildly, trying to catch someone else's eye, to find a shared look of bewilderment. Nothing. No one seemed to have noticed. Or, more unsettlingly, they had noticed and simply accepted it as a normal part of waiting for the bus. That evening, I mentioned it to Chloe, my flatmate. She was sprawled on our sagging sofa, scrolling through TikTok. "That's weird," she said, without looking up. A video of a cat falling off a counter played on her screen. Probably some new flash mob thing. Or a TikTok challenge. You know, like that dance everyone was doing to that sea shanty. There was no music, I said, my voice sounding thin even to me. And they weren't filming it. It was solemn. Solemn tick-tocks. They'll think of anything, she snorted, then swiped to the next video. The conversation was over. Her explanation was plausible. It was the most logical answer. And for a few days, I clung to it. A stupid, local trend. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The movements weren't joyful or performative. They were mechanical, rote. Like a prayer recited by someone who had forgotten its meaning. I started taking the earlier bus, the 7:38 a.m., just to avoid it. The crowd was thinner, mostly students. For a week, my mornings returned to their anxious normal. I almost convinced myself the 7:54 group was just a pocket of local eccentrics. Then one morning, my alarm didn't go off. I woke in a panic, threw on my clothes, and sprinted out the door, arriving at the bus stop at 7:53. They were all there. The nurse, the builder, the student. A few new faces. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood at the edge of the group, trying to look casual, trying not to stare. My phone's clock ticked over to 7:54. It began. Right foot forward. Left foot back. Head tilt left. The sound was clearer this time. A sibilant whisper. One word. Listen. It was a command. My breath hitched. I didn't move. I just watched, a statue of cold dread. The synchrony was perfect. Utterly, unervingly perfect. As they straightened up, their faces remained blank, impassive. The bus was still a minute away. The silence that followed was thick with an unnameable tension. An elderly woman at the front of the group. Her face a roadmap of wrinkles, slowly turned her head. Her coat was a faded tweed, her handbag clutched tight in her gloved hands. She wasn't looking at the road, or the sky. She was looking directly at me. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue, and they held no malice, just a strange, calm appraisal. She leaned towards me, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. You haven't learned your part yet. The words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't a question. They were a statement of fact. A gentle admonishment. Before I could process it, before I could form a reply, the bus arrived. The group shuffled forward, a single organism, and boarded. The old woman gave me one last placid look before disappearing inside. I was left standing on the pavement, the rain starting again, my mind screaming. Apart? Apart in what? The bus pulled away, leaving me alone with the sudden, terrifying certainty that this wasn't a TikTok challenge. This was something else entirely. And somehow, I was expected to participate. My work that day was a blur. I sat opposite my clients, nodding and reflecting, my own thoughts a maelstrom. My first client, a young man with social anxiety, spoke of feeling disconnected, of watching people interact and not understanding the rules. It's like they've all read a script I haven't seen, he said. The phrase sent a jolt through me. I had to force myself to apply standard therapeutic frameworks, to not blurt out, I know, I've seen it at the bus stop. I thought about the old woman's words all day. You haven't learned your part yet. The yet was the most chilling part. It implied an inevitability. It suggested that learning my part, whatever that meant, was not optional. That evening, I didn't tell Chloe. What could I say? That an old woman had confirmed my paranoid delusion. I went to my room and opened my laptop, typing mass psychogenic illness, shared delusions, folie à plusieurs. The clinical terms felt hollow, inadequate. They described hysterias, panics, anxieties spreading through a closed group. They didn't describe this quiet, orderly precision. This calm, communal ritual. I closed the laptop and went to the window, looking down at the street. A man was walking his dog. He stopped under a streetlight, took a bag from his pocket, and bent to clean up after his pet. A perfectly normal scene. But then he stood up, and for a fraction of a second, his head tilted to the left. The dog, a small terrier, mirrored the movement exactly. Then they continued on their way. I felt a wave of dizziness and gripped the windowsill. It wasn't just the bus stop. It was spreading. Or maybe I was just now starting to see it. The patterns in the static. My world, which had always felt fragile and chaotic, was revealing a hidden, terrifying order. And I was the one out of sync. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The old woman's words fractured my reality. Before, the ritual was an external curiosity, a weird thing they did. Now, it was a script I was failing to follow. The world split into two distinct groups, those who knew their part, and me. My first reaction was avoidance. I started walking to work. It took an hour and 20 minutes, a miserable, rain-sodden trek that left me damp and exhausted before my day even began. But it was better than the alternative. The bus stop felt contaminated, a stage for a play I refused to join. The walk, however, only widened the scope of my dread. I began to see it everywhere, a secret language spoken in gestures. In the supermarket, I watched a woman at the checkout. She placed her items on the conveyor belt in a specific, unvarying sequence: bread, milk, eggs, then a tin of beans. Then she paused, tapped the side of the credit card machine twice with her index finger, and only then did she slide her card in. A few minutes later, at another till, a man did the exact same thing. Bread, milk, eggs, beans. Tap, tap. I abandoned my basket in the aisle, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and fled the store. I started a journal, a cheap spiral-bound notebook I hid under my mattress. I titled it, Observations. The entries were paranoid and meticulous. November 5th. Saw the checkout ritual again. Tesco, Birchfields. Different people, same sequence. What does it mean? A mnemonic? A code? November 7th. A group of teenagers on the corner of Mosley Road. Not talking. Just standing. Every minute or so, one of them would scuff their right trainer on the pavement, twice. Then another would do it. A slow, asynchronous chain reaction. November 9th. The hum. I've started noticing a low-frequency hum in the city. Not just traffic or electricity. It has a pulse. A rhythm. It's loudest near substations and phone masts. Sometimes, the pulse of the hum seems to align with the flicker of the streetlights. A long flicker for a low pulse, two short flickers for a high one. Morse code. Am I going mad? I tried to talk about it again, this time more carefully. I framed it as a professional curiosity to my supervisor. Dr. Albright, I began, my voice carefully neutral during our weekly supervision. I've been thinking about nonverbal communication and social contagion. Small, repetitive behaviors spreading through a populace. She peered at me over her glasses, her expression one of clinical interest. An interesting field. Mass psychogenic illness, you mean? Like the Tanganyika laughter epidemic? Something quieter, I said. More orderly. Almost like unconscious social mimicry, but on a mass scale. And you've observed this yourself? She asked. I hesitated. I think so. Small things. Gestures. Dr. Albright leaned back, her chair creaking. Lena, you're a highly intuitive and empathetic person. It's one of your greatest strengths as a therapist. But it can also make you porous. Sometimes, when we are feeling anxious or overwhelmed, we can project our own internal sense of chaos onto the external world, and then try to find patterns to control it. It's a common coping mechanism. Are you still practicing your mindfulness? The conversation was a dead end. She had taken my genuine, terrifying observation and pathologized it, neatly filing it away under Lena's anxiety. It was a professional, gentle dismissal, but a dismissal all the same. I left her office feeling more isolated than ever. My own professional language had been turned against me, used to build the walls of my prison. My salvation, and my damnation, came from my caseload. His name was Arthur Pendleton, a man in his late 60s, referred for what his GP had diagnosed as late-onset agoraphobia. He was a retired cartographer, a man who had spent his life mapping the world but was now afraid to leave his own small corner of it in Chorlton. Our first sessions were conducted over Zoom. He was a small, neat man with restless, intelligent eyes. He described his anxiety not as a fear of people or open spaces, but as a kind of sensory overload. "It's the noise, you see," he explained, his voice a precise, educated rasp. "Not the volume. The texture of it. It's all wrong. The city doesn't sound random anymore. There's a pattern to it, a rhythm. The traffic flow, the sirens, the hum from the mains. It's all locking into place, and it's pushing me out." I nearly dropped my pen. "Pushing you out?" "Like a gear that's lost its teeth," he said, his thin hand sketching in the air. "The machine is turning, but I'm just spinning in place. It makes my head swim. The world feels thin. Like a projection." He was describing the flip side of my experience. I was seeing the performers, the human element. He was hearing the soundtrack, feeling the vibration of the stage itself. We were two different instruments, both horribly out of tune with the orchestra. I took a risk. "Arthur, this might sound strange. But have you noticed people? Their movements? Any repetitive gestures?" He frowned, looking at me intently through the screen. I try not to look at people. They're the loudest part of the noise. But yes. There's a man who walks his dog past my window. Every day. At 4:16 p.m. He stops by the lamppost, and he taps his left knee 3 times before he carries on. Every single day. I thought he had a touch of the old OCD. My breath caught in my throat. I think I've seen things like that too. A spark of something, recognition, relief, flashed in Arthur's eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt a crack in the wall of my isolation. I wasn't alone. This tentative connection spurred me on. I started to investigate with a renewed, almost feverish purpose. My secondary mystery became Arthur's thin world. I tried to record the hum he talked about on my phone, but the playback was just white noise. I tried to film the bus stop ritual, hiding across the street and zooming in. On the screen, it looked innocuous. A group of people shifting their weight. The synchronicity was lost, the shared whisper inaudible. The evidence was perceiver-dependent. You had to be there, untuned, to see it for what it was. My isolation deepened at home. Chloe had started humming. A low, monotonous 2-note tune. She did it while she cooked, while she watched TV. When I asked her what the tune was, she looked at me blankly. "What tune? I'm not humming." But she was. And the 2 notes she was humming matched the pulse of the hum from the refrigerator. She'd tuned into it. One evening, I watched her unload the shopping. Bread, milk, eggs, beans. She placed them on the counter in that order. My blood ran cold. "Chloe," I said, my voice shaking. "Why did you put them down like that?" She shrugged, still not looking at me. "Don't know. Just feels right, I guess. Just feels right." That was the horror of it. It wasn't forced upon them. It was being absorbed. It was becoming instinct. The contagion wasn't a disease, it was a new form of normalcy, a new kind of sense. And the more people who absorbed it, the more I, the observer, became the aberration. My world shrank to my flat, my miserable walk, my office, and my secret journal. The journal was getting full. I was no longer just documenting gestures. I was seeing the larger patterns. Traffic lights on a whole street would flicker in unison. Flocks of pigeons would turn at the same impossible, 90-degree angle. The headline of the Manchester Evening News on the stand outside the corner shop read, "Public urged to listen to new council guidelines." The word "listen" seemed to leap off the page. I was living in a city that was slowly, quietly rewriting its own source code. The people, the infrastructure, the very air seemed to be rehearsing for something. And my only ally was a retired cartographer I'd never met in person, a man who was as trapped as I was. One rainy Thursday, after another session where we spoke in hushed, coded terms about the rhythm and the script, I made a decision. I was a therapist. My primary ethical duty was to do no harm and maintain boundaries. But I was also a drowning woman, and Arthur was the only other person I could see afloat on this strange sea. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. "Arthur," I'd said, just before the session ended. "I think we need to meet. In person. There's a park halfway between us. Kringle Park." His fearful hesitation was palpable, even over the video link. But the look in his eyes was one of desperate hope. "Yes," he'd whispered. "I think we do." Breaking professional conduct was the least of my worries. I had to know what a mapmaker saw when the map itself started to warp. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Kringle Park was a swathe of tired green dissected by tarmac paths. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and distant traffic. I found Arthur sitting on a bench near the skeletal remains of a rose garden, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. He looked smaller in person, bundled in an anorak that was too big for him, but his eyes were just as sharp. He flinched when I approached, a Pavlovian response to a new human presence. "Lena," he said, his voice tight. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for being here," I replied, sitting at the other end of the bench. A carefully calibrated distance. The pigeons scattered and regrouped, pecking at the crumbs. "They're part of it too, you know," he said quietly, gesturing with his head towards the birds. "Watch." We sat in silence. The pigeons cooed and strutted. Then, as if on an invisible cue, they all stopped. Every single one. They froze, heads cocked, listening to something I couldn't hear. After 3 full seconds, they resumed their pecking. "It's a resonance," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. "That's the best word I have. Not a signal, like a radio wave. That's too crude. It's a resonance. A fundamental frequency. The city is vibrating at a new pitch. And some things, some people, are starting to harmonize with it." My therapist's brain latched onto the metaphor. Harmonize? "Think of 2 tuning forks," he said, turning to me, his eyes alight with the fever of his theory. "You strike one, and the other, if it's the right frequency, will start to vibrate in sympathy. Without ever being touched. We're living inside a giant, complex tuning fork. Most people are made of the right stuff. They hear the note. They start to vibrate with it. They learn the song. Their bodies, their routines, their subconscious. It just feels right, as your flatmate would say." "But not us," I whispered. "Why not us?" "We're the wrong material," he said, a sad smile touching his lips. "Our minds are different. Your anxiety, my agoraphobia. Perhaps they're not pathologies, Lena. Perhaps they are a form of immunity. A psychic dissonance. We can't harmonize. The note grates on us. It sounds like noise. We can feel the machine turning, but we can't join the dance. So we're left on the outside, watching the steps." A cartographer's theory. The world wasn't being invaded, it was being retuned. And we were the discordant notes. It was the most insane, and most comforting, thing I had ever heard. It meant I wasn't losing my mind. My mind was simply incompatible with the new reality. The stakes began to escalate in the weeks that followed. The rehearsals, as Arthur called them, grew more ambitious. One evening, walking home in the dusk, I witnessed it. I was at a crossroads near the university's Owens Park campus. The traffic was heavy. And then, for a full minute, everything synchronized. Every car, every bus, every cyclist moved with a preternatural grace. They flowed through the intersection without traffic lights, weaving between each other in a complex, impossible ballet. No horns, no near misses. Just silent, perfect motion. Then the moment passed, a driver blared his horn, and the familiar chaos of rush hour resumed. No one seemed to notice that for 60 seconds, the laws of traffic and probability had been suspended. The contagion, the resonance, was bleeding into the systems of the city itself. My relationship with Arthur became my only anchor. We met in the park once a week, exchanging notes like Cold War spies. He focused on the environmental phenomena, the rhythmic hum, the patterns in the power grid. I focused on the human element, the new rituals that were appearing. Dog walkers now paused at the same specific trees. The way people queued for coffee had a new, unspoken etiquette. Phrases began to repeat in conversation. I heard 3 separate people in one day say, "It's all about finding the right rhythm." They'd say it, then look confused, as if they didn't know why they'd chosen those words. The word listen was everywhere. It was scrawled in the dust on the back of a white van. I saw it composed of discarded lottery tickets in a gutter. It was the last word of a news report I overheard on the radio, the presenter's voice going strangely flat as she said it. The world was giving us instructions. My home life had become a quiet nightmare. Chloe was fully submerged. She moved around the flat with an unnerving, fluid grace. Her gestures were economical, her routines precise. She would wake at the same second each morning, her tea would be brewed for the exact same length of time, her keys would be picked up with the same 3-fingered motion. There was no wasted energy. She was efficient. Harmonized. The breaking point came when I found my journal. I had hidden it well, or so I thought, tucked inside a spare duvet cover in my wardrobe. I came home one afternoon to find it sitting on my pillow. It was open to the last page, where I had frantically scrawled my notes on the traffic ballet. Chloe was in the kitchen, humming her 2-note tune. "Did you go in my room?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She turned, her face a mask of placid confusion. "Your door was open. You read my journal." It wasn't a question. "I tidied up," she said. It was the same tone she'd used when explaining the shopping. A simple statement of an incontrovertible fact. There was no guilt, no defensiveness. "You're trying too hard to see the pattern, Lena. You should just let it happen. It's easier if you just listen." She used the word. And she looked at me with the same calm, appraising pity as the old woman at the bus stop. My flatmate, my friend, was gone. In her place was this serene, tuned stranger. My sanctuary was gone. The resonance had found me. It was no longer a passive phenomenon I was observing, it was actively trying to correct me, the discordant note. The journal on the pillow wasn't an accident. It was a warning. A final invitation. I packed a bag that night, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. I had to leave. I had to warn Arthur. I called his landline, my heart pounding. He picked up on the first ring. "Lena." "She knows, Arthur." "My flatmate." "She read my notes. She told me to listen." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, filled only with the faint, rhythmic hum that I could now hear on every phone call. Then Arthur's voice came back, tight with a new, terrifying urgency. "Of course she does," he said. "They all do. The rehearsals are over, Lena. I think the performance is about to begin. I've been mapping the energy flows, the resonance points. It's all culminating. Converging. Converging where?" I whispered, sinking onto my bed. "The old Mayfield Depot," he said. The abandoned train station. It's the epicenter. All the lines of my map point there. Tonight. Something is happening tonight. An abandoned train station. A place of arrivals and departures, of timetables and schedules. A place built for synchronicity. It was perfect. Stay away, Arthur, I pleaded. Get out of the city. Get out, he laughed, a dry, brittle sound. And go where? This isn't a Manchester phenomenon. This is a human one. Manchester is just the premiere. The first performance. I have to see it. I have to see what the map has been trying to tell me. Don't you? His question hung in the air. The terror was immense, a physical weight pressing down on me. But beneath it was a sliver of something else, a desperate, scholarly curiosity. To understand. To witness the final form of the thing that had dismantled my world. Running felt pointless. Hiding felt impossible. The only path left was forward, into the heart of the resonance. I'll see you there, I said, and hung up the phone. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The area around Mayfield Depot was unnervingly quiet. The usual thrum of traffic from the Mancunian Way overpass seemed muted, distant. The streetlights cast a steady, orange glow, their rhythmic flickering having ceased, as if holding their breath. It was just after midnight. The air was cold and still. People were moving towards the depot, but not in a crowd. They walked alone or in small, silent groups, converging from different side streets. They moved with a placid, unhurried purpose. There was no talking, no laughter. Just the soft scuff of hundreds of shoes on pavement, a sound that was beginning to find a shared rhythm. I saw the nurse from the bus stop, her face serene. I saw the man who had performed the checkout ritual, his hands loose at his sides. They flowed past me like water finding its course. I was a rock in the stream. I pulled my collar up and joined the slow procession, my own discordant footsteps a syncopated beat against their steady cadence. The entrance to the depot was a gaping mouth in a vast Victorian brick facade. No one was guarding it. There were no tickets. We were all expected. Inside, the space was cavernous. The immense glass roof was dark, save for the faint orange blush of the city lights. The old platforms were long. Empty stages. And on them, people were taking their places. They stood a few feet apart, forming a vast, silent grid that stretched back into the darkness. There were thousands of them. My flatmate, Chloe, was there, near the front. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't see me. She wasn't looking for anything. She was waiting. I found Arthur near a thick iron pillar, half hidden in the shadows, his old anorak making him almost invisible. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a kind of terrible awe. A congregation, he whispered, his voice trembling. This is a church. What are they waiting for? I asked, my voice barely audible. The conductor, he breathed. And then, it began. There was no sound, no signal I could discern. But a single, collective intake of breath seemed to pass through the hall. And the performance started. It wasn't a dance. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a function. The thousands of people on the platforms began to move. But it wasn't the bus stop ritual, or the checkout ritual. Those were just phrases, isolated words they had been practicing. This was the full language. Each person performed a unique sequence of slow, deliberate movements. A man would raise his left arm. A woman 30 feet away would turn her head. A teenager in the back would bend his knees. Every gesture was a cog in a colossal, silent machine. It was incomprehensibly complex, yet perfectly synchronized. It was horrifying. And it was devastatingly beautiful. I realized what I was seeing. They weren't worshipping anything. They weren't communicating with some alien intelligence. They were the intelligence. They were a single, distributed consciousness. A human superorganism. They're not being controlled, I murmured, the revelation hitting me with the force of a physical shock. They are the control. Arthur nodded, his eyes glistening. We thought it was a resonance changing the people. But maybe the people created the resonance. A new step in evolution. A way to deal with the chaos. They're smoothing out the static of individuality. They're becoming a single, stable waveform. The movements became more intricate. The city outside responded. Through the high, arched windows, I saw the lights of a distant tower block flicker in time with the gestures of 100 people on the platform. I felt a low vibration through the concrete floor, the city's hum, perfectly harmonized with the silent rhythm of the hall. The traffic, the power grid, the flow of information, it was all being directed from here. Not by a leader, but by the collective will of thousands of people, all tuned to the same purpose, a quiet, efficient, seamless operation of reality. This was the quiet contagion. Not a loss of self, but a donation of self to something larger. The anxiety, the loneliness, the confusion of modern life, all smoothed away, replaced by the serene certainty of having a part to play in a grand, flawless design. I looked at Arthur. He was swaying slightly, his body unconsciously trying to find the rhythm. The pull was immense. It was a psychic gravity, promising peace, belonging, an end to the strain of being a singular, fractured self. It promised to fix the part of me that was wrong, to finally let me in on the script. Arthur, we have to go, I said, grabbing his arm. His skin was cold. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrible conflict. The cartographer who wanted to observe, and the tired old man who wanted to stop fighting the map. It's so logical, Lena, he whispered. No more friction. No more noise. He slowly pulled his arm from my grasp. He took a hesitant step out of the shadows and onto the edge of the platform. He stood there for a moment, trembling, a glitch on the verge of being patched. Then, he straightened his back. He took a deep breath. And he performed a simple, graceful gesture, a slow sweep of his right arm, perfectly in time with a woman 20 rows ahead of him. His face, which had been a mask of fear and tension, relaxed into a look of profound, beatific peace. He had found his part. He had learned the song. He was home. He turned his head and looked at me one last time. There was no recognition in his eyes. Just a calm, silent invitation. Join us. Listen. I was the last discordant note in the symphony. The entire silent, moving, breathing organism of the depot seemed to be aware of me, the one stationary point in a universe of motion. The pressure to join was overwhelming, a physical weight on my chest, a hum in my bones. I felt my own foot wanting to step forward, my head wanting to tilt. The anxiety that had plagued my entire life was screaming at me to surrender, to let the current take me, to finally be at rest. But another part of me, the stubborn, frightened, individual part, rebelled. The part that felt terror and confusion and grief for the loss of Arthur and Chloe. The part that clung to the messy, chaotic, painful business of being just me. I turned and ran. I didn't sprint. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, pushing back against the psychic tide with every step. I walked out of the depot's great mouth, back into the city. But the city was no longer mine. It was theirs. The traffic flowed with silent purpose. The lights blinked with a shared consciousness. The few people on the streets walked with the same measured, rhythmic gait. I didn't leave Manchester. Where would I go? Arthur was right. This wasn't a place. It was a time. An era. This was what was next. I live in the gaps now. I've learned to. I am the observer, the glitch in the code, the ghost in the machine. I don't take the bus. I shop at strange hours. I speak as little as possible. I've learned to read the patterns, not out of fear, but out of necessity. I can see the great, silent choreography of the city. I can anticipate its movements. My anxiety is gone, replaced by a constant, cold hypervigilance. I am no longer a therapist. My work is obsolete. You cannot treat a person who is no longer a person, but a single, perfect cell in a flawless body. My new profession has no name. I am a student of a world that no longer includes me. I watch from the shadows, a remnant of a loud, chaotic, individual age, forever on the outside of the quiet contagion. I don't fight it anymore. I just watch. And I listen to the silence. The quiet contagion, mirrors within. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, until last Tuesday, was measured in words. Not the spoken kind, which have always felt clumsy and imprecise, but the ones I shepherd from German to English and back again. I am a translator. My world is a 14th-floor apartment in a concrete monolith on the eastern fringe of Berlin, a Plattenbau relic from a different era, grandly named the Himmelstern, the Heaven Tower. From my window, I see the dense green of the Muggelberg forest begin its slow march away from the city. It's a quiet existence, curated for focus. My clients are demanding, the texts, legal, technical, occasionally philosophical, are dense. Silence is my most valuable commodity. My apartment is my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built against the noise of the world. The first crack in that fortress was almost imperceptible. It came in the form of Frau Schmidt from 15b. She is a woman composed of sharp angles and softer, powdered scents, the unofficial warden of our floor. I met her by the elevators, my arms full of groceries. "Ah, Frau Richter," she chirped, her eyes crinkling. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Frau Schmidt," I replied, fumbling for my keys. She tilted her head, a bird-like gesture I'd seen 100 times. But then her expression shifted. The polite curiosity was replaced by something else, a look of genuine, almost clinical inquiry. "One moment, Ines," she said, using my first name, which was rare. "Tell me, what does your reflection show today?" The question was so bizarre, so out of context, that my brain simply refused to process it. I must have misheard. The acoustics in these hallways are strange, prone to echoes and distortions. "I'm sorry." "Your reflection," she repeated, her voice patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "In the mirror." "What does it show?" I stared at her. Was this some new slang the youth were using that had somehow filtered up to a woman in her late 70s? A philosophical query? A sign of encroaching dementia? I'm not sure I understand, I stammered. "It shows me, I suppose." A flicker of disappointment crossed her face. It was fleeting, but I saw it. "Ah. Well. Never mind, dear. You must be busy." She gave a tight little nod and shuffled off towards her apartment, leaving me standing in the sterile corridor, the smell of floor wax and her lilac perfume mingling in the air. I dismissed it. Old age is a country with its own language and customs, I was merely a tourist there. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and left Frau Schmidt's strangeness in the hallway. My apartment is laid out with monastic precision. Books are arranged by subject and then author. My desk is clear save for my 2 monitors, a keyboard, and a single, smooth gray stone I use as a paperweight. The only decorative indulgence is a large, antique mirror in the hallway, framed in dark, heavy wood. I'd inherited it from my grandmother. It was my one link to a past outside these concrete walls. I spent the rest of the day immersed in a patent application for a new type of industrial lubricant. The language was dry, technical, a puzzle of clauses and subclauses. It was comforting. It was real. When I finally logged off, my eyes grainy with fatigue, I went to the kitchen to make tea. On the way, I glanced at my reflection in the old hallway mirror. Me. Ines, 39, hair pulled back in a messy bun, faint lines of concentration etched around my eyes. Behind me, the familiar vista of my living room, the beige sofa, the overflowing bookshelf, the tall philodendron in the corner. Except, on the third shelf of the bookcase, nestled between a collection of Rilke's poetry and a biography of Hannah Arendt, was a small, blue ceramic bird. I froze, teacup halfway to my lips. I don't own a blue ceramic bird. I have never owned one. I am not a person who buys decorative knickknacks. Every object in my home has a purpose or a deep-seated sentimental value. A ceramic bird has neither. My heart began a low, heavy thud against my ribs. I turned around slowly. The bookshelf was exactly as it should be. Rilke, Arendt, a gap where the bird should have been. Nothing. Just books. I whipped my head back to the mirror. The reflection was perfect now. My living room, my bookshelf, no bird. Just an empty space between the two books. It was a hallucination. That had to be it. I hadn't taken a proper break all day. My brain, starved of stimulus beyond the cascading text on my screen, had simply invented something. Stress, I told myself, pouring the hot water. It's just stress. The body has a strange vocabulary for exhaustion. But the image was seared into my mind, the precise shade of cobalt blue, the delicate curve of its tail, the way the light from the lamp caught its glazed surface. It had looked so solid. So real. The next 2 days were blessedly normal. I worked. I ate. I slept. I avoided the hallway mirror, telling myself it was a silly precaution, while another part of my mind insisted it was a necessary one. I took the stairs to avoid the elevator and any potential encounters with Frau Schmidt. I was building my fortress walls back up, brick by rational brick. On Friday, the illusion of normalcy shattered again. I was in the shared laundry room in the basement, a damp, humming space that always smelled of bleach and forgotten socks. Herr Keller from 12C was there, a harried-looking man with 2 young children who were currently chasing each other around a cart of wet linens. Frau Richter, he said, nodding as he transferred clothes to a dryer. Herr Keller. He paused, a tiny pink sock dangling from his fingers. He had the same look on his face I'd seen on Frau Schmidt. That same intense, unervingly personal focus. Forgive me for asking, he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, but what is your reflection showing you today? The blood drained from my face. The hum of the dryers seemed to swell, filling my head. It was the exact same phrasing. Not, how are you, or, how's work, but that specific, nonsensical question. Why are you asking me that? I said, my voice sharper than I intended. His eyes widened slightly, as if my reaction was the strange part of this exchange. No reason. Just, making conversation. He quickly stuffed the sock into the dryer, refusing to meet my gaze. He gathered his children, who had stopped their game and were now staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, and practically fled the room. I stood there for a long time, the rhythmic tumbling of the machines a counterpoint to the chaos in my mind. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a weird Berlin fad. It was something else. A code? A shared delusion? 2 people, different ages, different floors, asking the same bizarre question. Back in my apartment, the silence felt different. It was no longer calming, it was predatory. The space felt charged, alert. I walked slowly into my bathroom and forced myself to look in the mirror above the sink. My face, pale and taut. The white-tiled wall behind me. Everything normal. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I leaned closer to examine my pupils, wondering if they were dilated, searching for some physical sign of my own unraveling. And that's when I saw it. Not in the room, but in the reflection. Over my shoulder, on the chrome handle of the shower door, a single drop of water hung, impossibly still. But it wasn't water. It was dark red, thick and viscous like blood. I didn't turn around this time. I knew there would be nothing there. I just stared at the reflected droplet, a tiny, crimson tear on the gleaming surface of my clean, sterile bathroom. It hung there for a full 10 seconds before it vanished. I backed out of the bathroom, my hand over my mouth. I went to my desk and opened a new document, separate from my work. At the top, I typed a heading, Anomalies. 1. Frau Schmidt, 15b, asks, what does your reflection show today? 2. Blue ceramic bird on bookshelf in hallway mirror. Not there in reality. 3. Herr Keller, 12c, asks the exact same question. 4. Drop of blood on shower handle in bathroom mirror. Not there in reality. Staring at the list, I felt a tremor of pure, undiluted fear. It wasn't just stress. My mind wasn't just playing tricks. Something was happening. And whatever it was seeping through the cracks of my carefully constructed world, starting with the one place you can never escape, your own reflection. The fortress was compromised. The enemy was already inside. Over the weekend, a new translation project landed in my inbox. A prestigious one. A dense, historical manuscript about the psychological toll of the Berlin Wall on the families it divided. It required immense focus, a deep dive into the nuances of trauma and memory. It was the perfect distraction, a professional lifeline. Or so I thought. In reality, it was an anchor, pinning me to my apartment, to the very place where reality was beginning to fray. I tried to work, but my concentration was shot. Every creak of the building, every distant shout from the street below, made me jump. I found myself obsessively checking mirrors. The polished back of a spoon, the dark screen of my phone, the window after dusk, which turned the entire Berlin skyline into a backdrop for my own haunted face. Most of the time, there was nothing. But the absence of anomaly was no longer reassuring. It was just a pause, a breath before the next strange beat. The question came again on Monday, this time from a teenager I'd never spoken to, one of the Keller kids, leaning against the wall by the mailboxes. He didn't even look at me, just mumbled it from under the hood of his sweatshirt as I passed. What's your reflection show? This time, the phrasing was slightly different, more casual, but the intent was the same. I ignored him, my heart hammering, and fled up the stairs, my own mail clutched in a sweaty hand. I was becoming a prisoner. The simple act of leaving my apartment was now fraught with a specific, targeted paranoia. They were testing me. Waiting for me to give the right answer. But what was the right answer? And what happened if I gave the wrong one? That night, I was rinsing my dinner plate in the kitchen sink. The small window above it looks out onto the access balcony that runs along the building's exterior. In the darkened glass, I saw my kitchen reflected. And sitting at my small dining table, where I had eaten alone just minutes before, was a man. He was thin, with a gaunt face and dark, hollowed-out eyes. He was just sitting there, in my chair, staring back at me from the reflection. He wasn't menacing. He looked sad. Resigned. I dropped the plate. It shattered in the sink. The noise was violent in the silence. I spun around. The chair was empty. The apartment was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked back at the window. The reflection was normal again. Just me, alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the glittering shards of a broken plate. I didn't clean it up. I backed away, out of the kitchen, and went into my bedroom, closing the door. I sat on my bed in the dark, my body trembling. The historical manuscript on my computer screen glowed faintly, its text about divided cities and fractured realities a cruel irony. The wall I was reading about was made of concrete and barbed wire. The one being built around me was made of something far more terrifying, glass, and light, and the quiet, creeping certainty that I was the only one who could see it. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The log became my secret religion, the only scripture that made any sense. The document, now password protected and buried in a nested folder of tax receipts, grew daily. Entry 11 hours 8 minutes and 17 seconds. Reflection in coffee pot showed the spines of my books were all blank. Lasted approximate 5 seconds. Entry 12 hours 15 minutes and 40 seconds. Loud, rhythmic tapping from apartment above. When I checked, I saw Frau Schmidt on her balcony, methodically polishing her large bedroom window with a cloth. It was a freezing afternoon. She did not seem to feel the cold. Entry 13 hours 21 minutes and 3 seconds. The sad man appeared again. This time in the black screen of my main monitor as it powered down. He was standing by my philodendron, touching one of its leaves. I began to feel watched, not by my neighbors, but by the myriad reflective surfaces of my own home. I started covering them. A towel over the hallway mirror, a scarf draped over the bathroom cabinet. I worked with my back to the window. It was a losing battle. Reflections were everywhere, the gloss of a magazine cover, the metallic sheen of a saucepan, the surface of a glass of water. Reality had become a funhouse, and I was the only one who couldn't find the exit. My isolation deepened. I started declining new work, offering vague excuses. The Berlin Wall manuscript lay untouched. How could I focus on the ghosts of the past when my present was so actively haunted? My contact with the outside world dwindled to text messages and brief, unsatisfying phone calls with my sister, Lena. "Ines, you sound terrible," she said one evening, her voice tinny and distant from her comfortable, rational life in Hamburg. "Are you eating properly? You've been working on that wall project, right? Maybe it's getting to you. All that grim history." I took a deep breath, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Lena, something strange is happening here. In my building." I tried to explain. I told her about the question, the same question from 3 different people. I told her about the things in the mirrors. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. "Things in the mirrors," she repeated, her tone shifting from concern to careful, measured alarm. "What kind of things?" "Things that aren't really there. A bird. A man. Small details, wrong." "Ines," she said softly, and I knew what was coming. "You've been alone in that apartment for a long time. You work from home, you barely go out. Your mind, it can play tricks on you. It's called the Ganzfeld effect, or something like it. Sensory deprivation. Your brain starts to create its own stimulus. This isn't the Ganzfeld effect, Lena. This is real. The neighbors. The neighbors are weird," she cut in. "People in big apartment blocks are always weird. An old woman says something dotty, a stressed out dad is awkward. That's not a conspiracy, Ines. That's just life in the city." Every rational word she spoke was another brick in the wall separating me from her, from the world of sanity. She was trying to help, but all she was doing was confirming my deepest fear, that I was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this. "Maybe you should take a break," she suggested. "Come to Hamburg for a week. Get out of that apartment." The thought was tempting, a gasp of fresh air for a drowning woman. But a darker thought followed immediately. What if I couldn't leave? What if the anomaly wasn't just in the building, but in me? What if I took it with me? Or worse, what if leaving was what they wanted? I mumbled something about deadlines and promised to think about it. We hung up, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier than ever. Lena thought I was losing my mind. Maybe she was right. But the fear felt too solid, too specific, to be a product of my own imagination. I had to find proof. Something tangible. My translator's brain, trained to find patterns and verify sources, took over. I started observing my neighbors more systematically. I'd stand by my peephole for hours, watching the comings and goings on our floor. The pattern I noticed was chilling. At least twice a day, one of my neighbors would stop in the hallway, position themselves in front of the polished brass casing of the fire alarm, and stare intently at their reflection for a few moments before moving on. Frau Schmidt did it. The Keller family did it, the parents guiding their children to do the same in a bizarre family ritual. They were checking. They were all checking their reflections. My research turned digital. I spent nights falling down rabbit holes of psychological phenomena, folie à deux, mass hysteria, shared psychotic disorders. I searched for combinations of keywords: shared hallucinations, mirror apparitions, reality distortion, apartment building. The results were a predictable mix of ghost stories, amateur paranormal forums, and scholarly articles that described nothing like the coordinated, specific nature of what I was experiencing. One forum post, however, snagged my attention. It was from 3 years ago, on a subforum for urban anxieties, written by a user named Clara S. Title: Is anyone else's building acting strange? This is going to sound crazy. I live in a high-rise in Frankfurt. Over the last few months, my neighbors have started acting weird. They all ask the same question. It's always about reflections. And I keep seeing things in my mirrors. Just little things. A book being open when I know I closed it. A different color shirt on my reflection. My husband says I'm working too hard. Am I going mad? My breath caught in my chest. Frankfurt. Not Berlin. But the parallels were undeniable. The question. The mirrors. I frantically clicked on Clara S.'s profile. She had made only 3 posts, all on the same topic, each more desperate than the last. Her final post was a single, chilling sentence. They showed me what's in my husband's mirror. I understand now. After that, nothing. The account was inactive. I sent a private message, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I think the same thing is happening to me. In Berlin. Please, if you see this, tell me what you saw. I knew it was hopeless, a digital scream into the void, but I had to try. The secondary mystery, the subplot to my own descent, became the sad man in my reflections. He was a constant now. I'd catch glimpses of him multiple times a day. He never did anything threatening. He would stand by the window, looking out. He'd sit on the arm of my sofa. Once, heartbreakingly, I saw his reflection reach out and run a ghostly hand over the frame of a photograph on my desk, a picture of me and Lena as children. He looked mournful, like a ghost, not of a dead person, but of a dead life. My life. My paranoia began to crystallize into a terrifying theory. This wasn't a psychological contagion. The people weren't sick. They were watching something. The question wasn't a symptom of their madness, but a test of my own awareness. They were waiting for me to see it too. The mirrors weren't windows into another dimension, they were showing something connected to us. To our own apartments, to our own lives. The breaking point came on a Thursday. A pipe under my sink, a real, physical, mundane problem, decided to burst. Water was everywhere. After shutting off the main valve, I knew I had to do the one thing I had been dreading, interact with a neighbor for a legitimate reason. The leak was dripping through my floorboards. It would be affecting the apartment below me, 13B. According to the building directory, 13B belonged to a Herr Vogel. A recluse. I'd only ever seen him once or twice, a quiet, stooped man with the perpetually weary air of a retired academic. Taking a deep breath, I went downstairs and knocked on his door. He opened it a crack, his face pale and unsmiling. Yes. Herr Vogel, I am so sorry. It's Ines Richter, from 14B. I have a burst pipe. I think water might be leaking into your apartment. He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he sighed, a sound of profound resignation, and opened the door wider. Ah. Yes. The stain. His apartment was a mirror image of my own layout, but where mine was ordered and sparse, his was cluttered with books, maps, and strange, intricate models of what looked like astronomical devices. And on the ceiling, directly below my kitchen, a dark, ugly water stain was spreading. "I've called the building manager," I said, wringing my hands. "I just wanted to apologize." "It is of no consequence," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He wasn't looking at the stain. He was looking at me. His eyes were heavy with a sadness I recognized instantly. It was the same sadness I'd seen in the eyes of the man in my mirrors. My gaze drifted past him, into his living room. A large, simple mirror hung on the far wall, opposite the door. It was angled in such a way that it didn't reflect Herr Vogel's living room, but seemed to capture the space where I was standing, in the doorway. It reflected the hallway behind me. No. Not the hallway. It was reflecting my apartment. I could see the layout clearly, my beige sofa, my desk, my bookshelf. I recognized every detail. But it was wrong. Utterly, horribly wrong. In the reflection, the room was in ruins. A thick layer of plaster dust covered everything like gray snow. My books were strewn across the floor, their pages warped and torn. The tall philodendron was withered and brown, its pot shattered. The furniture was overturned, splintered. And on the far wall, where the photograph of me and Lena hung, a vast, dark, web-like crack spread from floor to ceiling, as if the building itself had broken its spine. I let out a small, strangled gasp. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a different place. It was my place. My home. Destroyed. Herr Vogel saw the direction of my gaze. He saw the horror on my face. There was no surprise in his expression, only a deep, ancient pity. "It begins with flickers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Glimpses. But it gets clearer over time. More stable." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene of devastation in his mirror. What is it?" He finally looked at the mirror, not with fear, but with the weary familiarity of a man watching a slow, inevitable tragedy. "It is the reflection," he said simply. "We don't cause it. We don't control it. We just watch." The "we" hit me like a physical blow. He was one of them. He knew about the question. He knew about the anomalies. He knew everything. "Watch what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He turned his sad eyes back to me. "The truth," he said. "What does your reflection show today, Frau Richter? Is it beginning to show you the truth as well? The rationalizations, the self-doubt, the theories about stress and psychosis, they all evaporated in that instant, exposed as flimsy shields against a monstrous reality. It was real. It was happening. And I had just been given my first clear look at the end of my world. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. I stumbled back to my apartment in a daze, Herr Vogel's words echoing in the humming silence of the corridor. "We just watch." It wasn't a contagion of madness. It was a contagion of sight. A terrible, passive knowing. The question wasn't a password to a secret club. It was a diagnosis. Are you seeing it yet? My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a mausoleum in waiting. Every glance at a reflective surface was now an act of deliberate horror. I stopped covering the mirrors. What was the point? The truth was not in the mirror was merely the lens through which the truth could be seen. Avoiding it was like a child covering their eyes during a lightning storm, believing it could prevent the thunder. The reflected ruin of my apartment grew more detailed with each passing day. The blue ceramic bird I'd first seen now lay in pieces on the dusty, reflected floor. The image of the sad, gaunt man became sharper. I realized with a jolt of nausea that his clothes were the same as mine from the day before. He was not a separate entity. He was my reflection's reflection, a future version of me, worn down by the watching. He was what I was becoming. The behavior of my neighbors escalated from strange to ritualistic. The polishing of windows and brass fixtures became a synchronized, daily event. Every afternoon around 3 p.m., I would see them on their balconies or in the hallways, cloths in hand, buffing the surfaces with a quiet, solemn intensity. They were tending to their lenses, keeping their view of the coming catastrophe clear. The humming I'd occasionally heard became a regular occurrence, a low, tonal chant that seemed to resonate through the building's concrete skeleton every evening at dusk. It was a sound of communal mourning, or perhaps, of prayer. My research on the Declares forum post from Frankfurt became my only tether to an outside world that might understand. I created a dozen fake profiles, posting on different city forums: Munich, Hamburg, Cologne. High-rise residents, are your neighbors asking about your reflections? Most posts were ignored or deleted by moderators. But 2 of them got replies. A brief message from a user in Munich: stop asking. You don't want to know. Get out if you can. And a longer, more frantic one from a user in Cologne, whose building was called the Sternenbrück, Star Bridge. They call it the resonance. They say the buildings are listening to something. The reflections show the echo. My wife has started polishing the windows. She doesn't talk to me anymore. She just watches the mirror in our bedroom. She says it's beautiful. The resonance. The echo. So it had names. And it was in other buildings. Other modern, concrete towers reaching for the sky. The Himmelsturm. The Sternenbrück. Something about these structures, these vertical hives of isolated lives, made them susceptible. Were they antennae, built by architects who had no idea what they were channeling? Was this a side effect of technology, a psychological toxin baked into the very materials of modern life, or something far, far older, that had found a new way to manifest? The manuscript on the Berlin Wall sat open on my screen, a monument to my former life. I read a passage about Mauerkrankheit, or wall disease, the documented psychological distress, depression, and paranoia experienced by those living in the shadow of the wall. They were trapped, observed, their reality circumscribed by an impassive concrete barrier. I was living its 21st century equivalent. My wall wasn't made of concrete, but of glass. The watchtowers weren't manned by guards, but by my own neighbors. The threat wasn't escape, but the dawning, shared understanding of what we were all trapped in. Desperate for an ally, someone who was still on the cusp, I thought of the Keller family. They had 2 young children. Surely they wouldn't want this for them. One afternoon, I saw Frau Keller in the small, windswept playground at the base of the tower. Her son was on the swings, her daughter digging in the sandpit. Frau Keller was not watching them. She was staring at her own faint reflection in the dark screen of her phone, her expression placid and remote. I approached her cautiously. Frau Keller. She looked up, her eyes slowly focusing on me as if I were a great distance away. Frau Richter. Your children, I began, not knowing what to say. This place, what's happening here? It isn't safe for them. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. It is no safer anywhere else, she said, her voice soft. It is safer, perhaps, to be where one can see it coming. To be prepared. Prepared for what? I insisted, my voice rising. For our homes to fall apart. For us to just sit here and watch. Her son, a boy of about 6, had stopped swinging. He trotted over, his face serious. He looked at me, then up at his mother. Mummy, he said, his little voice clear as a bell. The lady's mirror is very loud today. Frau Keller stroked his hair. I know, sweetling. She is not used to the resonance yet. She looked back at me, her eyes full of the same pity I'd seen in her Vogels. It is not the reflections that are loud, Frau Richter. It is your fear. When you stop fighting it, you will find the silence. You will be able to watch, properly. She took her son's hand and led him away, leaving me standing by the empty swings. Defeated. They weren't victims of the contagion, they were its acolytes. They had found a strange, horrifying peace in their resignation. The stakes escalated in a way I could never have anticipated. It was no longer just about seeing. The echo was beginning to bleed through. It started small. I would smell something, the scent of damp, chalky dust, when there was no dust. I'd feel a phantom chill in one corner of my living room, the same corner where the great crack spiderwebbed across the reflected wall. The definitive bleed-through happened one morning. I woke up and went to my bookshelf to pull out my old copy of Rilke. My fingers brushed against something small and hard. I looked down. Sitting on the shelf, solid and real in the morning light, was the little blue ceramic bird. I didn't scream. I was too far beyond that. I picked it up. It was cool and smooth in my hand. Real. I turned and looked at the hallway mirror. In the reflection, the space on the bookshelf where the bird had been was now empty. The object had crossed over. It had traded places, leaving its reflected absence behind. The horror of this was profound. The reflections weren't just showing a potential future. They were showing a reality that was actively displacing my own. A slow, methodical conquest by an alternate, ruined world. What else would cross over? The dust? The broken furniture? The cracks in the walls? I looked at the blue bird in my palm. It felt like a final warning. Or perhaps, an invitation. That night, gripped by a surge of desperate, defiant energy, I decided to do the one thing that felt active, the one thing that felt like fighting back. I was going to destroy the primary lens. I was going to smash my grandmother's mirror. I took a heavy-bottomed pan from the kitchen, its steel base feeling solid and purposeful in my hand. I walked into the hallway and stood before the great, dark wood mirror. In its depths, my ruined apartment was starkly visible. The sad reflection of me stood by the shattered philodendron pot, watching me with mournful eyes. He looked tired. He looked like he was waiting. "No," I whispered, my voice raw. "I will not just watch." I raised the pan. I tensed my muscles, ready to bring it down, to shatter the image, to blind the eye that stared into my home. But as I looked at my own face, determined and fierce in the frame, I saw something shift in the reflection behind me. The door to my reflected apartment swung open. And standing in the doorway was Herr Vogel. And behind him, Frau Schmidt. And behind them, the Kellers. All of them, my neighbors, standing in the ruins of my home, their faces calm and expectant. They weren't looking at the ruin. They were looking at me. Through the mirror. My arm froze. The pan felt impossibly heavy. They were waiting for me. They were all waiting for me, on the other side of the glass. The resonance, the echo, it wasn't just something to be observed. It was a destination. And it seemed the price of admission was the total destruction of the world you knew. Smashing the mirror wouldn't save me. It would only trap me on the wrong side of the door. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The pan lowered slowly to my side, its metallic weight a dull anchor in the face of such immense, impossible truth. My act of defiance was revealed for what it was, a child's tantrum, meaningless against the turning of a cosmos. Smashing the mirror would be like trying to shatter the sky. The reflections weren't a medium, they were the message itself, a message the building, the Himmelsturm, was receiving from some unknown, unknowable source. My neighbors weren't on the other side of the glass. They were simply further along the path, their own realities having already crumbled and merged with the echo. My confrontation was not with them, but with myself. With the frantic, terrified part of me that still clung to the logic of a world that no longer applied. Frau Keller's words came back to me, "It is not the reflections that are loud. It is your fear." The humming in the building seemed to swell, not in my ears, but in my bones. It wasn't a sound of mourning. It was a frequency. A carrier wave. And my fear, my resistance, was static. I let the pan drop. It clattered onto the floor, the noise shockingly loud, then fading into the resonant hum. I looked back at the mirror. At the assembled faces of my neighbors, waiting patiently in the gray dust of my future. I looked at my own reflection, the gaunt man who was me, standing amidst his own shattered life. His expression was no longer just sad. There was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. A glimmer of peace. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I didn't fight the resonance. I let it in. I felt the hum settle into the rhythm of my own pulse. The frantic terror in my chest subsided, replaced by a vast, cold, and strangely tranquil emptiness. The static cleared. In that quiet, a revelation bloomed. This wasn't an invasion. It was a transformation. A shedding of a fragile reality for a more permanent, albeit broken, one. We weren't losing our world. We were being integrated into the building's true state, a state that existed on a different frequency, a reality of echoes and dust that was somehow more fundamental than the solid, temporary illusion I had called my life. These towers, scattered across the country, across the world perhaps, were not antennae by accident. They were tuning forks, built to resonate with this final, quiet truth. They were arcs, preparing their inhabitants not for a flood, but for a silence. I spent the next few days in a state of calm observation. I packed away my grandmother's photo albums and my few sentimental trinkets, putting them in a box in the back of a closet. They belonged to a world that was fading, like photographs left too long in the sun. I deleted the anomalies log and the Berlin Wall manuscript. Their narratives were irrelevant now. The bleeding through of the echo became more pronounced. A fine layer of gray dust, real and tangible, began to settle on my bookshelves and windowsills. I didn't clean it. It felt correct. The crack I had only seen in the mirror was now visible as a faint, hairline fracture tracing its way up the real wall. I ran my fingers over it. It was the first line of a new scripture being written onto the world. One morning, there was a soft knock on my door. I knew who it would be. I opened it to find Frau Schmidt. She was holding a clean, soft cloth. She didn't look at me, but at the hallway mirror behind me, which was now clouded with a film of real, physical dust. She offered me the cloth. Her eyes, when they finally met mine, were no longer questioning. They were welcoming. I did not take it. Instead, I turned and looked into my own mirror. The reflection was almost perfectly clear now, the ruin nearly complete. The boundary between the two realities had grown gossamer thin. The dust in the reflection was the dust in my apartment. The crack in the reflected wall was the crack in my wall. The gaunt, sad man was me, my face pale and serene. The two images were converging, settling into a single, unified truth. There was another knock at the door. Herr Vogel had arrived, standing beside Frau Schmidt. Then the Kellers, their children holding hands and watching me with old eyes. One by one, the residents of my floor emerged from their apartments, not speaking, but forming a quiet congregation in the hallway. They were not here to intimidate me. They were here to bear witness. Frau Schmidt looked at me, a genuine, gentle smile on her face, and asked the question one last time. It was no longer a test or a diagnosis. It was an invitation. A final confirmation. Ines. What does your reflection show today? I looked away from the faces of my neighbors, back into the mirror. Back at myself, standing whole in the wreckage. The last vestiges of fear were gone, burned away by the quiet hum of the resonance. I finally had the right answer. The only answer. My voice, when I spoke, was as calm and quiet as the dust settling around us. It shows me, I said. It shows me at home. A collective, silent sigh seemed to pass through the assembled group. It was a sound of relief. Of acceptance. Frau Schmidt nodded, her duty done. Herr Vogel gave me a small, sad, but comradely smile. They began to disperse, returning to their own apartments, to their own silent vigils. I was no longer isolated. I was no longer the lone observer of a creeping madness. I was part of the chorus now, another voice in the quiet hum. My life of translating words had ended. A new life, translating the silence between worlds, had begun. I closed my door and walked over to the window, looking out not at the forest, but at my own reflection superimposed over the darkening sky. The crack on the wall behind me seemed to have grown a little wider. I felt no alarm. Just a profound, unsettling, and final sense of peace. I was ready. We were all ready. We were just watching. Waiting for the last, fragile pane of glass to break. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with the feel of things. I've always been sensitive to texture, a trait that served me well as a part-time librarian. The crisp give of a new spine, the slick gloss of a dust jacket, the reassuring nap of an old cloth-bound cover, these were the tactile reassurances of my world. My life, here in the perpetually damp green of Portland, Oregon, was built on such things. It was a life of quiet order, me, my 8-year-old son Leo, and the hushed, sacred corridors of the Albina Library. The first wrong texture was in Leo's backpack. I was fishing for a permission slip he'd forgotten, my fingers rummaging past his lunchbox and a rogue Lego. I was searching for the telltale crinkle of cheap duplicated paper. I found nothing. "Leo, honey, where's the slip for the museum trip?" I called out. He was in the living room, watching cartoons. "Don't need one," he said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Yes, you do. Ms. Albright sent a note home." "No," she told us. "We just have to remember to tell you." A new agey, waste reduction policy, I figured. Annoying, but plausible. Still, I delved deeper into his bag. "Where's your notebook? The one with the astronaut on it? I wanted to see your spelling words." "Oh," he said, finally turning to look at me. "We don't use those anymore." "What do you mean, you don't use them? How do you practice your spelling?" Leo shrugged, a gesture of such profound indifference it felt alien on his small shoulders. "We just know them. Ms. Albright says it's more intuitive." I let it go. He was 8. Intuitive was probably just a big word his teacher used. I blamed the progressive Portland school district and its endless pedagogical experiments. I bought him the notebook because he loved the cover, the way the astronaut floated in a sea of holographic stars. The fact that it remained pristine, its pages an unervingly perfect blank slate, was a small, quiet failure that pricked at me. A week later, the wrongness seeped into my sanctuary. A patron, a regular named Mrs. Gable who smelled of lavender and peppermints, returned a copy of The Secret Garden. I scanned it in, the computer beeping its cheerful acceptance. As I placed it on the reshelving cart, my thumb brushed against an absence. I flipped it open. Chapter 4 was gone. Not ripped out in a fit of pique, but excised with a craft knife, the edge of the remaining page a clean, surgical line. I sighed. Vandalism. It happened. I set the book aside for processing, my mood soured. But the next day, there were 3 more. A cookbook returned by a culinary student, missing the entire section on sauces. A biography of Marie Curie, with her childhood in Poland neatly removed. A brand new thriller, its climactic chapter vanished. There was no pattern in genre or subject, only in method. All were cut with unnerving precision. I brought it up with my supervisor, Mr. Henderson, a man whose personality was as gray and unassuming as his cardigans. "Look at this, Bill," I said, laying the butchered books on his desk. "It's like a trend. Some kind of weird TikTok challenge." He peered at them over his bifocals, his expression placid. "People do strange things, Marla. Just mark them as damaged. We'll order replacements if the budget allows. But it's so methodical. Someone is targeting them. Maybe, he said, already turning back to his screen. Or maybe the bindings are just giving out. His dismissal was more unsettling than the act itself. The bindings weren't giving out. Pages don't just slice themselves from a spine. It was a willful blindness, a refusal to see the obvious strangeness. I felt a prickle of frustration, the kind you feel when you're the only one in a room who smells smoke. The contagion, as I would later come to call it, was a quiet one. It didn't announce itself with sirens. It crept in through the cracks of the mundane. The next parent-teacher conference was a study in serene absurdity. I sat opposite Ms. Albright in a classroom devoid of children's artwork. No clumsy watercolor paintings taped to the windows, no construction paper chains drooping from the ceiling. The bulletin boards were empty, covered in plain cork. "I'm a little concerned," I began, trying to sound reasonable. "Leo doesn't seem to be doing any written work. No homework, no worksheets." Ms. Albright smiled, a wide, placid expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're moving beyond those paradigms, Marla. Paper-based assessment is so limiting. It tethers a concept to a physical form. We're finding the children absorb the information more holistically without it." Holistically? How do they practice math problems? How do they learn sentence structure? They visualize it. They internalize the process. It's been remarkably successful. The children are much calmer, don't you think? And she was right. They were calm. The playground at recess wasn't a chaotic storm of shouting and running, it was a quiet space where children stood in small groups, staring at the middle distance. They weren't playing tag or drawing with chalk. They were just being. It was the placid stillness of a pond, and it terrified me. I talked to another mom, Sharon, as we were leaving. "Did that seem weird to you? The whole no paper thing?" Sharon, who once spearheaded a multi-page petition to get organic milk in the cafeteria, just adjusted the strap of her tote bag. "Honestly, it's a relief. One less thing to keep track of in the backpack, you know. It's all probably on the cloud anyway." But it wasn't on the cloud. I had checked. There was no class website, no digital portal. There was nothing. The curriculum had become ethereal, a ghost haunting the school's hallways. That evening, I tried to force the issue. I sat Leo down at the kitchen table with a fresh pad of lined paper and a newly sharpened pencil. "Okay, buddy. Let's draw something. A car. A dinosaur. Anything." He looked at the blank page with a kind of mild distaste, the way one might look at a peculiar but unappetizing food. He picked up the pencil, his grip awkward, as if it were a strange tool he'd never held before. "I don't remember how," he said, his voice small. Not petulant, but genuinely confused. He wasn't refusing, he was reporting a fact. The knowledge of how to translate an image from his mind to the paper via a pencil was gone. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and clear. "It feels heavy, Mom." "The pencil?" "No," he said, gesturing to the clean white sheet. "That. All of it." I pulled him into a hug, a knot of cold dread tightening in my stomach. My son, who used to fill entire notebooks with elaborate comic book panels, was telling me that a blank piece of paper was a burden. Later that night, long after he was asleep, I found the pristine astronaut notebook in the recycling bin, tucked beneath a crushed milk carton, as if it were an object of shame. I retrieved it, smoothing its cover, and hid it in the back of my own closet. It felt less like saving a notebook and more like preserving a memory of my son. The library became a landscape of subtle horror. More and more books were returned with pages missing. Soon, entire sections were gone. People would check out a thick hardback and return what was essentially just the covers and the spine. And no one complained. They'd run their library card through the self-checkout, take the hollowed-out book, and leave. My coworkers, even the usually persnickety ones, would shelve the empty husks without a second glance. "Bill, look," I said one afternoon, holding up a copy of Moby Dick that was nothing but a cardboard shell. This is ridiculous. We're a library. Our primary asset is the printed page. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses. He picked up the hollow book, weighed it in his hand. It's lighter this way, he said, with an air of profound discovery. Easier to carry. More accessible. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. He placed the book-shaped object on the cart. Put it back in circulation, Marla. Someone might enjoy the cover. I felt a wave of dizziness, the world tilting slightly on its axis. It wasn't just that they didn't notice the paper was gone. They were beginning to prefer it that way. The substance was being replaced by the symbol, and I was the only one who seemed to think the substance mattered. I started my own collection, hiding the damaged but not yet gutted books in a forgotten corner of the periodicals room. I was becoming an archivist of a world that was actively erasing itself, one clean, sharp cut at a time. My quiet life had been replaced by a quiet, creeping madness, and my greatest fear was that I was the only one who could see it. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The rationalizations crumbled one by one, like brittle, yellowed pages. Stress, I told myself. Perimenopausal anxiety. Maybe I was the one losing my mind, projecting my own sense of obsolescence onto the world. A librarian in an increasingly digital age, it was a cliché, but it felt true enough to hurt. I began to keep a journal, a thick, leather-bound book I'd been given years ago and never used. Writing things down, on actual paper, felt like an act of defiance. It was an anchor in a sea of placid absurdity. Entry 1, October 12, Leo asked me what a letter was today. Not the alphabet, but a piece of mail. I showed him the bills on the counter. He touched the paper as if it were a snakeskin. Why don't they just tell you, he asked. Entry 2, October 15, found a dozen travel guides in the return bin, all missing the maps. Not just the fold-out ones, but the ones printed on the pages themselves. Carefully, precisely cut out. Janice was shelving them. I asked her how anyone was supposed to find their way. She smiled and said, "You just have to feel the direction." My isolation became a physical presence, a cold spot in every room. Conversations with other people felt like speaking through thick glass. I'd try to broach the subject obliquely. "Did you see that article in the paper about the city council meeting?" I'd ask a patron. They'd look at me blankly. The paper, as if the word itself were foreign. The newspaper boxes on the street corners were still there, but when I opened one, it was empty. The next day, the box itself was gone. No one seemed to notice its absence. The space it occupied on the sidewalk was just sidewalk. My research led me down frustrating, useless rabbit holes. I searched for mass cognitive dissonance, shared psychological blind spots, cultural amnesia. I found academic papers on propaganda and fascinating articles on the Mandela effect, but nothing that explained this quiet, passive erasure. This wasn't people misremembering a movie title, this was people forgetting the very medium on which titles were once printed. The internet, which should have been my greatest tool, felt strangely complicit. Searches for the importance of paper or history of the book yielded fewer and fewer results. The links were still there, but they led to timed-out pages or error messages. The digital world was tidying up after the physical one. The secondary mystery began with a sound. The Albina Library is an old Carnegie building, full of drafts and groans. I was used to the rhythmic clang of the ancient boiler in the basement. But a new sound had joined it. A soft, dry, rhythmic shuffling. It was a sound I knew intimately, the sound of turning pages. But it was coming from the basement, a restricted area used for storing discarded furniture and holiday decorations. I asked Henderson about it. "It's the new HVAC system," he said, not looking up from his lunch, a sandwich he had unwrapped from wax paper, which he then folded neatly and threw away without a thought. "State of the art. very efficient. But it didn't sound like a machine. It sounded methodical. Human. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the building's drafts. The contagion was accelerating. It was no longer confined to books and schoolwork. Product packaging began to change. The cereal box was still a box, but the nutritional information panel was a smooth, featureless stretch of cardboard. The list of ingredients was gone. At the grocery store, I saw a woman holding a can of tomatoes, turning it over and over, her brow furrowed in mild confusion before she shrugged and put it in her cart. She wasn't looking for a recipe, she was looking for words that were no longer there, and the desire to find them was fading even as she searched. My world was shrinking to my small craftsman house, with its overflowing bookshelves and my secret stash of notebooks. My home felt like the last bastion of a forgotten reality. I started hoarding. I went to office supply stores and bought reams of printer paper, stacks of legal pads, boxes of pens. The cashiers would ring me up with pleasant disinterest. The items were still for sale, relics of a past no one but me seemed to remember had existed. It felt like stockpiling firewood on the eve of an ice age only I could see coming. My relationship with Leo was the sharpest edge of my fear. He was still my sweet, affectionate boy. He still loved my hugs, still laughed at my bad jokes. But there was a partition in his mind I couldn't cross. I tried to read him one of his old picture books, a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. He sat in my lap, listening, but his eyes weren't on the illustrations. They were on my face, my mouth, as if the story were an abstract song. "Look, Leo," I said, pointing to the page where Max's room turns into a jungle. "Remember this? The trees growing on the walls." He touched the page gently. The paper was thick, glossy. "The picture is loud," he whispered. "What do you mean, honey?" "It has too much stuff on it." He traced the intricate cross-hatching of Sendak's art. "It's better when it's quiet." He wasn't wrong. The world was getting quieter. The constant, low-level hum of information I'd always taken for granted was fading. There were no flyers under my windshield wipers anymore. The junk mail had stopped. The bulletin board at the coffee shop, once a chaotic tapestry of concert posters and roommate-wanted ads, now held only a single, thumbtacked sheet of blank white paper. The shuffling sound from the basement continued, a furtive heartbeat beneath the library's placid exterior. It became an obsession. Henderson had told me to ignore it, which only strengthened my resolve. It was a clue. It had to be. It was the only anomalous sound in a world growing ever more silent. I needed to know what, or who, was making it. One evening, after the library had closed, I told Janice I'd forgotten my car keys in the staff room and that she should go on ahead. The lie came easily, I was getting good at them. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency kit, I unlocked the heavy oak door to the basement. The air that rose to meet me was cool and smelled of damp earth, dust, and something else. The faint, dry scent of paper. I descended the wooden steps, my sneakers making no sound. The only light was the weak glow of a single, bare bulb far across the concrete floor. The boiler clanked to my left. The HVAC Henderson had mentioned was silent. But the other sound was here, louder now. A soft, insistent sifting. Rustle. Pat. Slide. It was coming from behind a looming row of old metal shelving units, rusted monuments to a forgotten cataloging system. I moved towards it, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. I rounded the edge of the last shelf, and my breath caught in my throat. There, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the center of a small pool of light from a clamp lamp, was a man. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a wild mane of white hair and clothes that looked like they'd been worn for decades. He was surrounded by cardboard boxes, dozens of them, and piles of paper scraps. He wasn't reading them. He was sorting them. With the intense, focused precision of a diamond cutter, he was picking up small, torn pieces of paper from one pile and placing them into a specific box. My flashlight beam fell across him. He flinched, shielding his eyes with a paper-dusted hand. He looked up at me, not with the alarm of a trespasser caught in the act, but with the weary resignation of a man whose sanctuary had finally been breached. I found my voice, a harsh whisper in the cavernous space. "Who are you? What are you doing?" He blinked, his eyes adjusting. They were pale blue, and shockingly lucid. He gestured with a scrap of paper held between his thumb and forefinger. His voice was a dry rasp, but it carried a strange urgency. "Quiet," he whispered, glancing at the ceiling as if he could be overheard. He looked back at me, at the undisguised fear and confusion on my face. A flicker of something, kinship, maybe, passed through his eyes. "They're taking the wrong words," he said, his voice dropping even lower, a conspiratorial murmur that was more terrifying than any shout. "I'm keeping what matters." Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. His name was Arthur. He had been the head archivist at the Albina branch for 40 years before he'd retired, a euphemism for being gently pushed aside when his meticulous, paper-based cataloging system was deemed obsolete. He never really left. He just migrated to the basement, a ghost in the library's machine, sustained by a forgotten pension and an all-consuming purpose. He wasn't the cause. He was the opposition. "They're not people," he explained, his voice a low, urgent hum beneath the groaning pipes. He never specified who they were. It was a pronoun without an antecedent, a force as nebulous and pervasive as gravity. It's a thinning. A simplification. Reality is shedding complexity, like a snake sheds its skin. And paper is the anchor. I sat on an overturned crate, my flashlight lying between us, pooling light on the dusty floor. I was listening to a man who lived in a basement surrounded by paper scraps, and I had never felt saner in my life. "The words on the page give an idea weight," he continued, holding up a small, triangular piece torn from a novel. The words, "sudden, irrational hope," were printed on it. They make it real, give it a place to live outside of a single mind. When the anchor is gone, when the paper is gone, the idea doesn't just get forgotten. It becomes undone. It never was. He gestured to his meticulously organized boxes. They weren't sorted by genre or author. They were sorted by concept. One box, labeled with a single, hand-drawn star, was filled with scraps containing words like wonder, imagine, and celestial. Another, marked with a simple drawing of a house, contained shelter, hearth, and belonging. They started small, Arthur said, his eyes distant. Obscure historical treaties. Out-of-print poetry. Technical manuals for defunct machines. Things no one would miss. But they're getting bolder. Recipes. Maps. Now, just basic instructions. The fine print of the world is vanishing. And the people, they're not being controlled. They're being lightened. Their heads are being emptied of all the difficult, messy, contradictory concepts that make us human. It makes them calm. Placid. Simple. Mr. Henderson's serene smile flashed in my mind. The quiet children on the playground. Sharon's relief at an empty backpack. They weren't malicious. They were becoming smooth. Unburdened. "What about the words they're taking?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The ones in the books upstairs. The pages being cut out. Decoy words. Trivialities," he scoffed. "Plot points, descriptions of weather, dialogue. Fluff. It's a misdirection. The real work is in making the idea of the page itself useless, so all the words, important and trivial alike, lose their anchor and drift away. They don't need to destroy every word if they can convince everyone that the vessel doesn't matter." The world outside the basement was proving his theory correct with terrifying speed. The very next day, I tried to test it. I went to the post office to buy stamps. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful person named Gloria who had a different festive pin for every holiday, gave me a blank look. Stamps, she repeated, the word sounding like a cobblestone in her mouth. Yes, you know, to mail a letter. She pointed to a sleek, gray machine in the corner. You just use the terminal. Enter the destination code. There was no field for an address. Just a keypad for a 9-digit code that corresponded to a person. The concept of a physical address, street names, numbers, cities, states, was being streamlined into non-existence. I saw a man walk up to the terminal, tap in a code, and slide a small, plain gray box into a slot. The box vanished with a soft whoosh. There was no paper label on it. The environmental warping became more pronounced. Streetlights no longer just flickered, they blinked in complex, rhythmic patterns, like a silent, coded message passing over the city. I was driving Leo home from a friend's house when I glanced at the familiar green of the Fremont Bridge. For a split second, it wasn't green. It was a shimmering, featureless silver, a textureless shape against the sky, before it snapped back into its solid, riveted reality. I gasped, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Leo, sitting beside me, hadn't noticed a thing. He was humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. My only ally was Arthur, a man who smelled of dust and desperation. I started sneaking him food from the staff fridge and old newspapers I found blowing down the street like urban tumbleweeds. In return, he educated me. He was my Cassandra, my prophet of the quiet apocalypse. One evening, he pressed a small, folded piece of paper into my hand. It was thick, creamy stock, torn from an old, high-quality book. Don't lose this, he said, his fingers closing over mine for a second. They were surprisingly strong. And don't let them see it. It's an anchor. A strong one. For you. I unfolded it later, in the privacy of my locked car. Just one word was written on it, in elegant, archaic script, remember. The trust one had in Arthur was fragile. A part of me, the rational librarian part that was clinging on by a thread, screamed that this was folie à deux. That I'd found a madman in a basement and simply adopted his delusions as my own. Was he the source? A twisted bibliophile orchestrating this whole thing? My doubt was erased a week later. I went down to the basement with a thermos of coffee for him. The door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. A cold dread, colder than the basement air, washed over me. I pushed it open and descended. The clamp lamp was off. The basement was plunged into a thick, profound darkness, broken only by the dim red glow of the boiler's pilot light. The shuffling was gone. The silence was absolute. Arthur. I called out, my voice trembling. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam cut through the dark. His sorting station was in disarray. Boxes were overturned, their precious contents scattered across the concrete floor like confetti. Scraps of paper with words like mercy, grief, sacrifice, and story were mixed in a meaningless pile. And in the center of it all was Mr. Henderson. He stood there, placid as ever, holding one of Arthur's empty boxes. Beside him were two other library employees, their faces serene and blank. They weren't being violent. They were simply tidying. Methodically, they were sweeping Arthur's life's work into large plastic bins. The kind used for recycling. Henderson looked at me, a flicker of mild surprise on his face. Marla. You're working late. Where is he? I demanded, my voice raw. Where is Arthur? Henderson looked at the empty space where Arthur had always sat. A brief shadow of confusion crossed his features, as if he were trying to recall a dream. Who? He asked. The name, the man, the entire concept of him, had been swept up with the paper. The anchor was gone. And he had been undone. My hand flew to my pocket, closing around the small, folded scrap of paper he had given me. The word burned against my fingertips, remember. I backed away, up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. They didn't follow. They simply continued their quiet, efficient work, erasing the last library of a forgotten world. The contagion had found its antibody, and it had neutralized him. I was alone again, and now, I was being hunted. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The library, my former sanctuary, had become the epicenter. I knew I couldn't go back to work, couldn't face Henderson's placid, empty gaze. I called in sick, my voice a strained imitation of normality. But I knew I had to go back one last time. I had left behind my secret stash, the books I had rescued, the astronaut notebook. My own small archive. I went at night. I used my master key, the metal cool and solid in my trembling hand. The library was dark, but not empty. A soft, ambient glow emanated from the main reading room. I crept toward it, my sneakers silent on the linoleum. The sight that met me was one of sterile, organized desecration. The great oak reading tables had been pushed together to form a massive platform. Upon it, every single book from the library's shelves was being piled. Not in a bonfire, not in a chaotic heap, but in a neat, ever-growing ziggurat of paper and binding. Henderson was there, along with Janice and a half-dozen other library employees and volunteers. They moved with a slow, synchronized grace, like practitioners of a silent martial art, emptying shelves, carrying armloads of books, and placing them on the pile. There was no malice in their actions. Only a profound, unsettling purpose. They were gathering all the anchors in one place, creating a critical mass of meaning that, I suspected, would collapse under its own weight, taking the last vestiges of a complex world with it. I saw a copy of The Secret Garden, perhaps the very one Mrs. Gable had returned, placed on the pyre. Its cover was beautiful, its contents now irrelevant. The symbol was all that remained. "It's much more efficient this way," a voice said beside me. I jumped, stifling a scream. It was Henderson. He had approached without a sound. His eyes, behind his glasses, were calm. Utterly, terrifyingly calm. "What are you doing, Bill?" I whispered, my voice choked. "Making things simpler," he said, gesturing to the mountain of books. "All this weight. All these contradictory ideas. It's so confusing. So heavy. We found a better way. A quieter way." I wanted to scream at him, to talk about history, knowledge, art, stories. But I knew the words would be meaningless. They were sounds without anchors, concepts he no longer possessed the framework to understand. He was a vessel, cleaned out and ready for a new, simpler purpose. Then I saw Leo. He was standing near the children's section, holding a stack of picture books. My heart stopped. He wasn't a prisoner, he was a participant. He walked toward the great pile, his small face etched with the same serene focus as the adults. He saw me, and a smile lit his face. It was my son's smile, but it was hollow. It was a reflection of love, not the source of it. "Mom," he said, his voice clear and sweet. "You came to help." He walked over to me, his eyes falling on my hand, which was clenched into a fist in my pocket. He reached out his own small hand and gently tried to pry my fingers open. "What are you holding, Mom? You don't need to carry that. It's heavy." This was the confrontation. Not a battle of strength, but a battle of meaning. My son, my beautiful, brilliant boy, was offering me salvation. He was offering me the peace of emptiness, the quiet of the contagion. All I had to do was let go of the scrap of paper in my pocket. All I had to do was let go of the word remember. I looked from his clear, loving, empty eyes to the mountain of books, the tombstone of a world of ideas. I saw Arthur's face in my mind, his frantic, desperate effort to save the words that mattered. I thought of the astronaut notebook, of Leo drawing for hours, his mind on fire with stories. I made my choice. I opened my hand, but not to give him the paper. I knelt down and pulled him into a fierce hug. "I love you, Leo," I whispered into his hair, a desperate incantation. Then I scooped him up. He was light, but he was a dead weight, resisting not with force, but with a deep, sorrowful inertia. "No, Mom," he pleaded, his voice filled with a terrible, calm grief. "We have to finish. We're making it better." I didn't answer. I turned and ran. I ran past Henderson, whose face showed only mild, clinical surprise. I ran out of the library, the automatic doors swishing open into the cool, damp Portland night. I didn't stop until I had Leo buckled into his car seat and I was behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. We drove. I didn't know where. The street signs were blank white rectangles. The familiar logos on storefronts were just geometric shapes. The city was losing its vocabulary, its identity bleeding out into the quiet night. People on the sidewalks moved with a slow, aimless grace, their faces untroubled. Leo was quiet in the back seat. Not sleeping, just watching the featureless world slide by. I drove until the city lights faded behind us, heading east, towards the mountains. I pulled over on a dark, empty stretch of highway. In the glove compartment, beneath a tire gauge and old registration slips, was a book. A thin paperback of children's poems I'd kept in the car for emergencies, for boredom. I turned on the dome light. The pale glow filled the car. I turned in my seat and held the book open for Leo to see. His eyes were blank. My voice trembled, but I forced it to be steady. I pointed to the first word on the page. "Once," I read, my voice a small, defiant whisper in the immense silence. "Once upon a time. I don't know if I can save him. I don't know if I can outrun a contagion that is rewriting the very essence of reality. The world I knew is gone, hollowed out and left as a tidy, meaningless shell. But as I drive into an unknown future, through a landscape of ghosts, I hold on to the books I managed to save. I am no longer just a librarian, or a mother. I am an archivist of a dead language. I am the paper collector now." And in the encroaching quiet, I read aloud, my voice a tiny, desperate anchor against the encroaching tide, hoping to teach my son how to remember the weight of a word.